Hello there and welcome to episode 125 of Right Where You're Sitting Now. This week we have got a really exciting guest on, a magical Buddhist, you might say, or a Buddhist with magical occult leanings, Daniel Ingram, notorious for claiming enlightenment, which is kind of frowned upon within the Buddhist community, but Daniel doesn't really care and has instead decided to try and make enlightenment available for everyone. What a scandalous character that is. I mean, who wouldn't want to be enlightened? But and not only that, he's written books and on the subject, and he's made many texts available for free online. He believes in open source enlightenment. He's very technologically advanced, which is not something you kind of necessarily associate with a Buddhist teacher sometimes. Maybe I'm being incorrect there, but that's at least my bias, I suppose, or my discriminatory thought process. He used to be an emergency physician by profession, and he's done his medical work around the world, including in India, where he, we'll talk about that in the interview, but interesting stuff. And he is involved with various charitable organizations these days that try and bridge the gap between spiritual experience and medical scientific rigor, I suppose. It's really fascinating, but he's also incredibly interested in chaos magic and other forms of the occult, so it's going to be a really interesting one, this. And I should pre-warn you that when I recorded this interview a day or so ago, it was very hot, and unfortunately, I hate to disappoint my listeners, but I had to remove my hat. And I know every time I do this, I get flack for it, because I know in your mind you like to believe that underneath this flat cap there is a Samson-like mane of hair. Unfortunately, that is not the case. In fact, it couldn't be further from the case, as you'll see. But just pre-trigger warn you if you're, that way inclined, I suppose. But anyway, this week we have a kind of a sponsor, not really, but sort of a sponsor. We have an advert to roll for you very quickly. It's very brief and quite amusing. So let's roll that, and then we'll come back and I'll quickly sell Patreon to you as well.
My name is Inspector Gibbs, and I'm investigating the disappearance of Rowan Morrison.
Hello, I'm Ulysses Black, and for a man with such a tiny mouth, I have a lot to say.
Excuse me, Heathen, have you seen this girl? What about this? What about her? And this? And this? And this? Seen her? What about that?
You're playing with fire, Inspector.
Did I do it right?
You did it beautifully! Ritual and the Wicker Man, now available from ulyssesblack.com/shop.
There you go. Bye. Ulysses Black's books are always fascinating and incredibly well put together. Like, the artwork's usually worth it alone if you're just interested in the art. But the writing's very good. And Ulysses was recently on, I think we mentioned this in the last episode, but he was recently on AP Strange's podcast. I think it's just called the AP Strange Show, where he talks about this very book and other examples of ritual in cinema. Anyway, before we get to the interview, very quickly, let's talk about Patreon. Patreon.com/sitting now. I think it's $5 a month, and that rolls over to the UK as well, so it's not even £5, it's like £3 or something here. Quite cheap, about the price of a cup of coffee. And you get a monthly show with myself and Alan Greenfield called The Greenfield Files, where we pick a topic each month, and Alan does his Alan thing. And if you're a fan of Alan Greenfield, it's well worth joining just to check out the archive, I suppose. We also have a Discord server where you can chat to like-minded souls, and the two of them met in person recently, so we're making physical connections, corporeal connections, as well as digital ones. What else do you get? You get extended editions. This one might be an extended one, but it's so good I'm not sure I want to cut it for the general population. We'll see. Probably will be, to be fair, because it's the patrons deserve their cuts. And what else? And we have some merchandise coming up soon. T-shirts, beanie hat, and something else. I can't remember what the other thing is now. I've been very busy. And yes, they will be available to patrons first. We also have a custom T-shirt coming soon, designed by a very well-regarded comic book artist here in the UK, and it's going to be great. And again, that will be initially available to patrons and then to the broader public. But yeah, we have some other exciting stuff coming soon as well. Again, patrons will probably get that first, so it's kind of worth it if you want to come support the show and get to know some other people that were interested in the same thing as you, and get an exclusive podcast with Alan Greenfield and early access. All that for the price of a cup of coffee. You can't go wrong, really. Anyway, enough shilling. Let's get to our interview with the amazing Daniel Ingram. Hi, Daniel Ingram. Thank you so much for coming on the show. This is a great pleasure to have you on. Could you give us a brief biography of yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. Delightful to be here. Thank you so much for doing this. Brief bio. I started having weird experiences as a kid. So was I a weird kid, as Gordon White would often ask? Yeah. And I started having odd experiences when I was quite young. Started having interesting, blissful, and peaceful experiences when I was very young that I would later associate with jhanic factors, which is a Buddhist meditation term for sort of states of tranquility or trance or whatever you would call it. And then I started lucid dreaming at age 5. I remember my first lucid flying dream where I sort of swam up into the air and had this sense of control and being in the dream and knowing I was dreaming. And so then I became something of a lucid dreamer just sort of by accident. And then I took a weird course in 4th grade at a Carolina Friends School, which is a Quaker hippie school in Durham, North Carolina. The other Durham. And I know you have one too. So it was like visualization, like getting really small and walking around your body and fixing things that were broken or whatever, and just checking stuff out, or getting really big, like bigger than the school, bigger than the universe, or squeezing your toes and relaxing them, feeling the healing light coming in. It's that kind of stuff, sort of basic relaxation and visualization meditations. And then when I was around 14 or 15, I started using that basically to try to have better lucid flying dreams, because I really liked flying dreams. Have you had a flying dream?
No, I don't think I have. No.
Oh my golly, they're really cool. A lot of people in the audience probably will. They're pretty common, and it's a delightful feeling. And I wanted to have more of them. So I was just, before I would go to sleep, I started visualizing flying between these giant, like 50-foot billiard balls in space. And I would go up and touch like the blue one and then turn around, visualize myself going over to the red one and put my hand on it and turn around and touch the green one or whatever. So that turned out to be enough meditation tech to get me to my first major opening, which is where in a dream my consciousness exploded like a fireworks display, and I was suddenly like sparks flying all over my bedroom, and I like zapped back together and was awake, in the sense of not being asleep and dreaming. And then my whole body was buzzing like crazy and had all this sense of energy, and like I was made out of particles or vibrations or something, or electricity. And then shortly thereafter, I had my first out of body experience, where like the classic lift out, float through the wall, freak out, snap back, buzz, and paralysis. And what the heck was that? It only lasted a few seconds, but it was a very dramatic experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was kind of off and running. So I didn't realize that had activated some kind of process that when you start studying traditions, a lot of people will talk about some kind of activation of this thing. You can call it lots of different names and you find lots of different words for it, but that was sort of happening. And I was a teenager in suburban North Carolina in the early 80s and had no idea what the hell this stuff was, and didn't really have access to people who seemed to know anything about it. So I spent 10 years navigating this weirdness pretty much to myself, and luckily had the good sense not to tell my very kind and well-trained pediatrician father what was going on with me, as he now admits he would have done something really stupid and harmful had I explained to him the bizarre energetics and weird other things that were now happening to me. And then I ran into some people who had done a whole lot of meditation and a whole lot of retreats, and I started going on intensive meditation retreats. This is in my mid-20s, and basically started training to be a meditative athlete. So like can you replicate all the stuff in the old text with high enough dose of these ancient Buddhist techniques, pretty much. And so I spent, some 10 years kind of obsessed with that while I crashed around in various places, off to India and volunteer service and various jobs and eventually grad school. So I ended up having these two sort of lives. So life number one is like, a School of Science and Math and physics and chemistry major before doing English, but then electrical engineering and then public health school with a lot of biostatistics and medical school and emergency medicine and healthcare administration, all that stuff. Like this is Daniel number, whatever Daniel this is. And then you got the other Daniel that was like going on super intensive meditation retreats and having all these weird experiences, and then later reading magical texts and trying to blend these two things together. And sort of my sister's husband's sister's ex-husband, a gentleman I will call Honey Bunny, because that's what we often called him in those days, was a Thelemite and very interested in exchanging. So we spent about a half year exchanging books. So like he sent me book 4 and I sent him the Visuddhimagga, and we would sort of read each other's stuff and go back and forth. And so I got sort of a rudimentary education, I will call it, in Crowley and Golden Dawn and OTO stuff, the standard AA, whatever kinds of things. And he then got to look into Buddhist stuff. And then we started comparing. And one of the places where we found a lot of overlap was related to elemental practice and some of the visualizations and stuff with fire and looking at a candle and playing around with candle flames and entities and energies and these kinds of things, which are mentioned a lot in both. And you don't see that a lot in most Buddhist contemporary circles, because what happened during the colonial era is all of the weird kind of got crushed out of Buddhism in its traditional settings, right? With a Protestant rationalists in quote unquote age of enlightenment, ironically named people coming into various countries, and Buddhism sort of saying, oh, I guess we have to look really normal and scientific and rational, sort of stripped out a lot of the esoteric stuff. There's a cool book called Esoteric Theravada, by the way, by Kate Crosby, if people want to get a feel for what that's like. Or another one called the Buddha's Wizards. It's a book about the Burmese, crazy people who do this stuff. And so I lived in these two worlds, right? And these two sides of myself didn't really talk to each other. And then about 7 years ago, my friend, Dr. Julieta Galante, who was a senior postdoc at Cambridge in the Department of Psychiatry, who was very interested in integrating some of the Buddhist maps and the Western psychological clinical maps, said, hey, why don't you spend the summer at Cambridge? And then this fascinating friend circle that I'd accumulated over the years talking about this stuff was like, hey, Daniel, what are you doing with your summer? I'm like, oh, Julieta invited me to this project at Cambridge, and it's to help the clinical mainstream and the public health and scientific mainstreams better understand the deep end of human experience, and particularly the sort of highs and lows and plateaus of the path, the sort of like, first opening, dark night, integration, awakening, whatever you want to call it, to understand that better. And a lot of these people are like, hey, where do we sign? And they just happen to be like neuroscientists at Harvard and stuff like that. So there's a lot of very impressive people and with a lot of degrees and a lot of horsepower. And before we knew it, we were the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, dedicated to helping the mainstream better understand the weird. And before I knew it, I was the de facto administrator of this strange thing. And so I've been doing that for 7 years. And then I built a charity to help support this stuff. And I retired from clinical emergency medicine about 8 years ago. And that's sort of a short summary of my journey. And I still do a lot of retreats where we do very intensive practices that create a lot of magical experiences. So I think that'll be interesting to talk about.
Yeah. I've always wondered, actually, because I've not heard you talk about it before, but have you ever encountered the gateway experience before? The I've forgotten the name of the institute now. It's like an audio thing that triggers.
Are you talking about Monroe? Are you talking about like the
Monroe
stuff where they do remote viewing and all of that?
Yeah. I was wondering if you'd ever encountered any of that.
A little bit, not formally like practicing gateway stuff, but you do end up, I do end up talking to a lot of people who do remote viewing, who do stuff where they do that. Sometimes visionary experiences have showed up where I've seen things or known things at a distance, where it doesn't make any sense. I've never had any control of that. I've never been able to say, oh, let me, zero in on this set of coordinates and see if there's a missile there or something. Never done any of that kind of creepy spy stuff with psi, but I have had experiences, and plenty of my friends have as well, where suddenly you know things that it doesn't make any sort of materialist sense for you to know because of separations and distance or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So how about you? Have you ever done any gateway stuff?
Yeah.
Oh, what do you think?
We ran I did it once on my own, and then we ran an experiment where a group of us did it on our Discord with the Patreons for the podcast. And that kind of was a bit disorganized, so I think we'll probably try and do that again. But then one of our listeners sent me, I've told this story before, I think on our other podcast, but one of our listeners sent me his own version of the gateway sort of files, I suppose. He felt that they were out of date and wanted to upgrade them with some new technologies, and would I be a test subject for him because he enjoyed the show and he'd be interested in my feedback. So they sound like just awful, horrible noise. You have to kind of endure it for his version anyway. And then I had this bizarre experience with one of them, which wasn't an intended experience. It wasn't it was kind of an out of body experience, I suppose, where everything kind of turned to static. Like, you remember old fashioned television static, like white noise. All I could see was white noise, and this face pressed through and said, and it's the weirdest thing. It said, "I am Krishna. From this moment on, if you try to eat meat, you will be sick. It'll be, your body will reject it." It was the strangest thing. And at the time, I was doing the keto diet, so I had a lot of meat in the house, and I actually had a meal waiting for me after I was doing this. And I tried to eat it. It was mince, of some sort of beef mince, and I had to run. I've never had to run so quickly to the toilet in my life, and just it was like The Exorcist. Honestly, it was the strangest experience, and ever since then, I've not been able to touch meat. I can't go anywhere near it. I can't eat meat, fish. I used to be a vegetarian, so maybe it was my subconscious going, "Look, Ken, what the hell are you doing?" But it was, yeah. So this stuff works. It does something anyway. But and you hear some quite crazy stories about the Monroe tapes. People seem to develop this quite relationships with kind of other beings and other realities and things like that. So it's interesting. It sounded like something I could imagine you having fun with. But
that reminds me of two things. The first is to have a face come out of sort of a dark screen of static, or and sort of bulge out, is actually a very common thing we encounter on Fire Kasina retreats.
Oh, interesting.
And the second thing is that I was actually snorkeling in Belize one time, and I came around this coral. It's just sort of swimming at the surface, and there, lined up in a row, were 3 squid or cuttlefish or octopi or something with tentacles on the bottom and big eyes looking at me. And they said to me, as clear as day, in my mind, like someone was speaking to me. It wasn't like a thought. It was like the sense of distinct audio. And they just said to me, "Please stop eating us." And I immediately stopped eating calamari and all of those things. And so,
yeah, it's the strangest. Yeah. It was. It wasn't just that. It was the actual physical response afterwards when I went to eat meat. It was, honestly, it was like I'd been shot with like a dart or something, and I was just like, "Oh!" I had to run to the toilet because it was, it was started to immediately. My body just rejected it, and I've actually felt infinitely better since, actually,
nice.
Which is a good thing. So yeah. So it was obviously something telling me something wise, I think.
Excellent.
So anyway, I want to get back to, I want to know a little bit about what you were doing before all of this. What was a young Daniel Ingram like? What was your kind of upbringing?
I grew up mostly in suburban North Carolina. My father is a pediatrician, and my mother initially was doing doctoral work and things at some fancy universities, and then took a very different turn and went off to wander out into the world and do all kinds of adventures in consciousness and meditation and things. So I grew up, on the one hand, with a very muggly dad, though he does see ghosts, which is a fascinating thing to get him talking about. He's like one of these like 50s, 90, engineers with pocket protectors and slide rule guys, except that he sees ghosts. So that's my dad. And then my mom is everything alien, galactic council, the spaceship is behind the planet Venus with the Greys and the Draco reptilians, and sort of cosmic right is the best way to describe her. And so I grew up with this sort of fascinating mix of two influences. And what was I like? I was playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, riding my bicycle a lot, liked frisbee, things like that, playing guitar, being yeah.
So a pretty standard kind of upbringing. So what kind of were you kind of, you sort of mentioned that you were interested in kind of spirituality pretty early on. What was the kind of initial pull, do you think?
Well, again, these blissful, peaceful experiences I had when I was really, really young, like 3.5 or 4, sort of stuck in my memory. And then my lucid dream world became this fascinating thing, where dreaming became a huge part of my life and practice, and would have all these magical experiences in dreams and all these very strange and actually often somewhat conflict heavy or kind of terrifying experiences in dreams. So as I say all the time, a lot of people initially would sound envious of my dream life, but I wouldn't want to subject anybody to it, because a lot of it was actually quite awful or disconcerting. But if you have a dream life that is like that for long enough, eventually you sort of get used to it. You sort of get the joke. This is just a dream, and then that gives you a certain capacity to work with it in a way that that eventually gets some sort of maturity to it after years and years and years of strange and challenging and very odd. So that was an intrinsic part of my practice. I went through a Presbyterian phase. That was interesting. So somewhere in my early teens, very cool youth group, some really nice people with really good ethics, trying to help the world and make people, suffer less and be happy more. And so that was a cool phase. And then sort of went back to, on the one hand, still playing Dungeons and Dragons, and on the other hand, being a rigid scientific materialist, and on the other hand, with this fascinating dream life, and on the other hand, so like not really a coherent worldview, I would say. If someone asked like enough questions, like you would realize my worldview made no sense at all and was utterly contradictory because of these sort of parallel, unintegrated things that were not really talking to each other. And which is contrasted now with this phase now where I get to use my English literature training, and I get to use my weird dream experiences, and I get to use my meditative stuff, and I get to use my MD side and my electrical engineering side, which helps with neuroscience. And so I get to, and my public health side, where I did a lot of training in study design and analysis. So I get to now do a lot of research to help the clinical world better understand the strange things I was going through as a kid, and hopefully other people's, they get to benefit from all of this, and have put together a really cool group of people around the world with a lot of academic horsepower who help study this stuff. So it's fun to actually watch all these divergent parallel tracks that I never thought would really talk to each other or get along and reinforce each other and support each other. So that's been a nice change.
Yeah. I mean, historically, the medical and scientific world hasn't responded particularly well to the sorts of experiences you've described. Nope. And often respond with medication, inappropriate medication.
Mm-hmm. There were about 10 of us in medical school when we were in our second year, and they were we were taking our psychiatry courses about all the diagnoses and the experiences they would diagnose as this mental illness, or this is schizotypal, or this is psychosis, and there was about 10 of us that were all like very nervous, like okay, we have had these things, and yet somehow we're in the top third of our class in medical school, in a good medical school. So and we're functional, and we can really contribute, and yet we have had some very weird experiences, and sometimes still do have very weird experiences, and some of us intentionally cultivated those very weird experiences. So and found value in them, and actually found real healing and insight and other things that are hard to quantify or explain why they're beneficial, but they were. So a re-enchanting of life that gave it more richness and more of something very valuable in the magical, in the mythic, in the strange.
I think re-enchanting's a necessary thing in the world at the moment, personally. We talk about this, I talk about this a lot, this difference between when society stopped enjoying mystery and started to over embrace cynicism. This kind of idea of, you know, you see it a lot with the way people discuss, say, films on online. People will, oh, the ending, it didn't, the ending wasn't explained, or, you know, like for a David Lynch film, as an example, like people get very frustrated with David Lynch's films because he doesn't tell them what he's, you know, he doesn't show his working, really, does he? He doesn't really sort of say, this is what this film's about. He leaves it for you to interpret. And I find in life that's seems to be a fairly common thing these days, where people want solid answers to things and they don't. Whereas I feel that as a culture, we used to enjoy mystery and, like you say, enchantment. Do you agree with that? Or
Absolutely. Like, I'm a huge fan of Peter Greenaway's films, which a lot of people really don't like, but they have a quality of majesty and artistry. And he sometimes does give answers at the end, but people almost always don't like them. So, like, yeah.
Yeah, it feels like maybe
it's hard to imagine a Greenaway in making films like that these days.
Yeah.
Or Terry Gilliam, like Brazil, or films like that. It's very hard to imagine those being made today.
Yeah, especially with budgets like that. I mean, I'm a big fan of a director called Nicholas Winding Refn, who he made a film. I think his one real big film was a film called Drive. But he makes these very kind of abstract, kind of mysterious, very beautiful films. They're a lot of people say it's style over substance, but there is substance there. You just have to kind of sort of swim in it and not ask too many questions, which is kind of how I enjoy a film personally. But
excellent.
I was raised by my grandmother and grandfather were abstract art. Well, my grandfather was an abstract artist, but so I've always, and I'm named after him. He died before I was born, so I grew up around his abstract paintings. I think they had some kind of strange effect on me.
Yeah, I totally appreciate that. My wife is an abstract artist, actually, and she does paintings that are, a lot of people find like disconcerting or disturbing, but they have a lot of depth and layers, and they subtly hint at lots of things while not being anything. Sort of like if you imagine a journey in a cave in the underworld with swirls and fascinating organic hints that hint at things, kind of, depending on how you look at it, with a lot of layers and depth and possibilities. And I really appreciate that sort of art. Yep.
Yeah. It's it's certainly something I resonate with. You were saying earlier on you had someone that you had almost like a book club with, well, like a sort of book exchange with.
Honey Bunny.
Yeah. Did you find that? I mean, I would have loved to have had something like that, you know, when I was first learning. Did you find it quite useful to have?
That was incredibly useful. So Honey Bunny was extremely versed in magical texts, had, you know, basically had a massive library of rare Crowley, Golden Dawn stuff. You know, the kind of person who had all the journals and all the obscure texts and the out of print stuff, and certainly a lot of wiser stuff also, and a lot of like sort of more mainstreamy kinds of things. But the more interesting stuff was the fancy, old, hard to get, expensive, like, you know, big Austin Ogman Spare. Did I say? I'm terrible with names. Anyway, the big book with all the art that's like apparently hard to get or something sometimes. And so like that kind of stuff, and also knew it really well. Like, not just owned it, but you could tell had studied it and read it and practiced it and lived it. And to have someone who had that level of expertise, who was really interested in sharing and teaching, and also interested in correlating it with the stuff that I was reading, which was a lot of stuff out of the Pali Canon. That's the text that original, you know, Theravada Buddhism was written down in, early Buddhism, and then the commentarial tradition, which came later, which sort of tried to systematize it and added its own layers of things. And so it was great to have someone with that level of expertise and depth and practice knowledge, who really took this self seriously and really did the practice and had been for a long time. That was incredibly helpful.
I found it interesting. You said earlier about Buddhism going through something. We've discussed the same thing actually on the show a few times, but from different traditional points of view, which is this idea that Buddhism kind of got westernized a bit and de-magicked.
A lot.
Yeah, that kind
a
of
lot.
Yeah, that happened with Tantra as well, didn't it? In India, where but that was more, rather than the Christians, it felt that was more Blavatsky and people like that were kind of stripping it of things that they didn't feel were what's the word I'm looking for, like civilized, I suppose,
Yeah, the
almost.
Victorian sensibilities had
Yeah,
a fascination with the erotic, with the macabre, with the whatever, but also an aversion to it as well. This very
yeah.
strange push-pull, right,
Mhm.
towards all things like that.
Yeah, it's but it was interesting to hear that Buddhism also mainstream Buddhism as well, by the sounds of things.
Oh, and then when it came here, like it went through a number of waves of this. So the first was the big reform movements in the 1800s, early 1900s into the middle of the 20th century, that happened in Thailand and Burma and places like that. Myanmar, well, it wasn't Myanmar then, but and then when it came to the West, the way it was transmitted, weirdly enough, through the hippies, right, who wandered off on the hippie trail, and then what they brought back with them was an incredibly sanitized version of even what you find in Thailand or Cambodia or Vietnam or places like this, where there is still a lot of animism, there's a lot of ritual, there's a lot of beliefs that then just did not translate to a secular Western audience. And then with mindfulness coming in that attempted to mainstream the stuff and did in a lot of ways. But the compromise they made is they said, we shall not touch the weird. Thou shalt not talk about the weird. There is no weird. Buddhism
Yeah.
is just not weird. It's just paying attention and calming down and learning to relate skillfully to thoughts and feelings and pain and things like that, which those things are certainly in Buddhism, but that's like 3% of it, not even. If
Yeah.
you read the old books, like what's the focus of this thing? It's just quite broad and
Yeah.
include plenty of stuff with realms and entities and energies and powers and visions and very, very curious experiences. And so yeah, that is a lot of different ways of sanitizing all of this.
Interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
what was your when did you first start to like really engage with Buddhism? What was your first kind of retreat and this sort of
I
thing?
did a 9-day. So
Mhm.
I kind of went from nothing to some people convinced me that I should go on a meditation retreat. This is Kenneth Folk and Bill Hamilton. And then I just went from basically nothing except my curious dream life and strange things that had happened to me along the way and sort of homebrewed ways of relating to those to a 9-day intensive Vipassana retreat at Insight Meditations Center with Christopher Titmus and Jose Rezig and Charda Rogel. And that was very intense. It's like probably 12 or 14 hours a day of meditation practice, like 45 minutes sitting, 45 minutes walking back and forth, with a little bit of contact with teachers and a little bit of time to help in the kitchen or whatever. But it was very, it's almost all in silence. And there were Dharma talks, but, we aren't talking to other people, not making eye contact, very sort of strict Western style Vipassana. And that was very, very powerful. And suddenly, in the course of 9 days, I had the kind of intense experiences back to back to back that I, would have every year or two, sort of in my own life, and unfolded in this very particular sequence that I would then get very used to. And then a few retreats later, find the books that describe that sequence, and like, oh yeah, that's the sequence. And then I was kind of off and running. So I started doing like a lot of daily practice and a ton of study. And this is before the internet was really what it was. So it was very hard to find much content about this online. So I had to literally, I took a trip to the UK to buy the Visuddhimagga because it was the only place I could find it. Dylan's books, this huge bookstore in London, and I was able to find a copy and literally went to the UK to buy a book. I mean, sort of gives you the sense of how serious I was about it, and also like how hard it was then. Now you have everything, right? You can just get everything with either, if it's not online in a PDF, you can Amazon and it's there the next day, or on Kindle that moment. So
Thankfully, they had it in the store. Otherwise, you would have been it would have been a wasted journey, but
yeah,
potentially.
right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, what sort of surprised you the most about kind of intensive meditation? Would you say at first?
The things that were the most surprising were A, that it led to such powerful effects and reproducibly. B, that these were almost never talked about, at least in the initial Western Vipassana circles that I ran in. Third, that these were mapped out in precise detail, not only like the experiences themselves, but the patterns, the unfolding of them, the sequences, and then all kinds of advice for what you do in each of these to make it easier to navigate, to deal with whatever, high or low or weird thing is happening. And then like, what's the next thing you do to look for it to get to the next stage? So it was very gamified and worked out 2000 plus years before I got there. And that the next thing was like, I was so angry that nobody had told me, like, how is this not known? How is this technology not available? Why was I a teenager struggling with this stuff when 2000 plus years before people had mapped all this stuff out and knew about it? And like, why was that not mainstream technology? And then 5, realizing that there were so many people who had also had these kinds of experiences who were wandering around lost. So I would be on these retreats and someone would present with one of these experiences that I'd now had myself a bunch of times and now read a bunch of books on that described. And the teachers would just say sort of platitudes like, oh, just sort of let it go and find your breath or something. And these people were really needing to process something that was much more elaborate or intricate or complicated than that. And there was no space for it or language for it or support for it, even though the traditions that these people in theory were trained in, the teachers, and that in theory we were training in, had tons of that technology. So somewhere in the mid-late 90s, I wrote a book that started trying to explain this stuff as a confused 20-something-year-old stumbling around in this territory. And then I also hung out a shingle and said, hey, if you're having weird, meditative, energetic, whatever, eventually psychedelic and other strange experiences, I'll talk to you about that for free, and I won't even take a donation. And it turns out when you print an online PDF that people back then were printing out on their office printers or whatever, and you eventually found an online community, or co-founded with my friend Vince Horn, we co-founded the Dharma Overground with us and a few other people. And this is a place online where you could go and talk about this stuff. It turns out when you do all that, you get to talk to thousands of people, because there were thousands of people who could not find anybody who would talk about this stuff. Their meditation teachers wouldn't talk about it. Their friends didn't know about it. Their psychiatrists often reacted terribly to it. And so they were looking for someone to at least have a conversation with, to tell their story. And so that was the most shocking thing, is how many people also had a very similar experience to mine. And because of codes of silence or stigma or taboo, or people just being appropriately scared, I think, because family members and friends and the medical world often react very badly to these things, desperately needed to talk about this stuff. So I got thousands of emails and ended up having literally thousands of conversations over 30-something years now. It's been doing this. And we got to share the journey, and I got to learn a lot from them, and they got to tell me their stories. And sometimes, hopefully, I gave advice of some utility and didn't do too much damage. And we all got to grow together. And so those are some of the biggest surprises that came out of the whole thing of doing intensive retreats and finding what the deeper world of all of this stuff for myself.
I think there's one thing that isn't discussed a lot with meditation, is that sometimes it can be difficult as well, in terms of and I don't mean just difficult in practice. I mean, some of the results can be difficult as well,
difficult,
in terms
like
of
kill yourself difficult.
Yeah. What kind of kept you kind of pushing through those particular periods, would you say? Because they are difficult. I mean, I've come across some of that myself, and I find it very difficult, to put it lightly. But
I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. What was it that allowed me to navigate this territory, some of which was extremely bizarre, very challenging, physically difficult, emotionally difficult, energetically difficult, and just sort of perceptually very confusing or disorienting or bizarre or destabilizing. I think it was a bunch of things. The first is, for whatever reason, I'm gonna go Gen X a little bit. So being a Gen X, solidly in the center of Gen X, we were pretty much taught, suck it up. No one's there to save you. You better figure shit out on your own. You're alone. Don't talk about it. Don't talk about your feelings. Figure out how to be incredibly capable, because it's going to fall on you. So that was sort of the culture and the era and the mode. And you see videos like on YouTube talking about, the Gen X male, and they're kind of slightly cartoonish and slightly exaggerated, but mostly true. Like, I'm like, yeah, that is it. Like that does mirror my experience. And so I was kind of in a culture where you just kept calm and carried on, which is sort of a very British stiff upper lippy sort of thing to do. But that's the first thing. The second thing is I have something of a tolerance for physical pain. Like I've had a whole bunch of kidney stones and just didn't, would take a Tylenol or a shot of Toradol, which is like fancy ibuprofen or Motrin, basically, for it occasionally. But like I have something, and if you have a tolerance for physical pain, that gives you something of a tolerance for emotional pain.
Mm.
Right? Because if the emotion can only hurt you because it actually hurts, sort of, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
if you're like, oh, it hurts, but okay, like, yeah, that really hurts. That's really scary. I'm having physical sensations of fear or terror or disgust or anger or sadness or grief or whatever, or just existential dread or confusion. Well, there was this sort of like, okay, it's just another thing that hurts. Okay, I can handle pain. Like it's sort of got this caveman stupidity to it, right?
Mm.
That's not like
Yes. You kind of argued your way through it a little bit.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
this is not profound advice. It's just sort of shouldering on in the face of challenging things. And then I think I do get some stability from my dad. My dad is very, very sort of rational, reasonable type. And then my mom is like very comfortable with the deep end and the weird and the strange.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and so I think I drew from some of the better ends of both of my parents.
Yeah.
And then luckily in some of the worst of it, I met some really good people who were able to do what I later ended up getting to do for a whole lot of people, which is to normalize, to be there when I cried or screamed or whatever it was, and hold space for that in a way that, like, yeah, I can do that sometimes. Here's some little tips and advice, and just having somewhere to be witness and like to normalize and to hold that space, and to know they had gotten through it, and that so I could get through it. That was very helpful. I'm very, very grateful for some of those people along the way who showed up at really critical moments, almost in that like magical, like you hit the depths of the underworld and then finally like there's the helper person who, and like there were a number of those moments that seem beyond coincidence, even though I'm not saying they were, but you get the idea. They had that feel of being beyond coincidence. So a tremendous amount of gratitude for them.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people rag on magical orders, like the OTO, for example. But there is that element to them that is kind of priceless in a way, that the kind of the others, the kind of finding a group of people that are interested in the same thing or experiencing the same thing, even, not just through initiation, but through, practicing similar practices and being able to kind of relate to that person is incredibly valuable. When I was in the OTO, that was I'd say the biggest thing was the other people. It wasn't so much the initiations were great and everything, but the communication was the priceless thing, really, for me. But yeah, so it's good to hear that the groups exist for other people as well. When did you realize that you were going to kind of go all in on Buddhism, as it were?
That first retreat, like when it, like there was so obviously a there, like there was so obviously so much power in these techniques, and I could see some of the people who had really been doing it a long time and really done high doses of it and really gotten something out of it. The best of them were very, very impressive, and I could just feel it. And I was like, yes, that's the direction. So after the first retreat, I was kind of off and running, and then everything in some ways had some element of being oriented around that. Like when I went off to India to do volunteer medical service for getting into medical school and getting life experience or whatever, part of that was also, and I can do retreats here. Right? Like, yes, I can volunteer with Mother Teresa's Missionaries of Charity or Calcutta Rescue in the slums of Calcutta or but I can also go on retreats with Christopher Titmuss, or I can go to Malaysia, or I can go, because it's all there. And they have these books, and they have this as part of the culture, and they have resources, and I can hang out in Bodh Gaya at the Burmese Vihara with all these people coming through who like to do deep practice, or the Root Institute, and they have good libraries, again, which were so valuable then before the internet was what it was, and real practitioners, real depth, and real opportunities to see for oneself, and people who cared about these things. Again, a bunch of, Christopher Titmuss, British hippie who wandered off on the hippie trail, co-founded Gaia House, cool place. And yeah, very grateful for them.
Do you think your sort of time as like an emergency physician, sort of working with, I guess, with death and illness and this kind, do you think that influenced your kind of understanding of Buddhism?
Oh God, yes.
Mm.
So suffering, truth number one, dukkha, right? This often translated as life is suffering, or there is suffering, or whatever. And what is suffering? If you look at the Buddhist definition, it's grief, lamentation, death, birth, pain, sorrow, despair. You get to see those in abundance in the emergency department. The sort of memento mori, remember death. I have seen a lot of people die, and a lot of people die at all kinds of ages, and a lot of people die tragically of all kinds of things. And I've gotten to see what good deaths look like and bad deaths look like, but it's all death, and something is coming for us all, and it will likely suck. And maybe suck really badly for a really long time, like astounding amounts of suffering. And so that's one of the things that drives me every day to get up and do what I do, is the clock is ticking. I'm 57. I feel it, like you can tell. It's like the 40s, it's like, okay, wait a second. And the 50s, it's like, oh yeah, okay. Yep, I know this one because I've seen it thousands of times before. And emergency medicine also, you find amazing people in emergency medicine. You find incredible people in the trenches of the front lines of the sort of war that is that front line of healthcare. It's like a kind of like a war zone in some ways. It's wild. And you also find saints there. You find living people who are just incredibly kind and incredibly well integrated, incredibly skillful in the face of people's pain and sorrow and difficulties. And you get to learn from them how to relate to that, not only just in other people, but then in yourself. And you get to mirror these incredible people that I got to be around, who would show a way to be in that environment, seeing day-to-day horrors every day, and yet relate to it in ways that were really good. And so also one of the things you learn, I think I've mentioned this before, you get very good at flipping between different modes really fast. So the example I've given in a bunch of podcasts, but it's still a really important one. Like when you're running a code. So I was the attending physician, I'd be running the code, and you're barking out commands in a life or death situation, which 7 out of 8 times means it ends in death, right? About 1 in 8 times, about 12% of the time, you revive the person if you're running the code, and the rest they die, right? Because they were sort of dead to begin with, to some degree, right? And so it's a is tons of adrenaline pumping through you, and it's very high pressure, and the stakes are incredible. And then you might have 30 seconds after the person died, or even like if they live, but often they live, but right, it's usually something, but you're about to tell somebody something bad, right? Even if you just said we coded them and they lived, but there's always a but there, because it's usually not free, having been that close to death. And so you have about 30 seconds walking down the hallway with the chaplain or whoever is taking you to the room where the family is, if they weren't in the room for the code, to walk in. And if you walk in command, like run a code mode, it's going to go really badly. They react terribly to that. And if you walk in more pastoral, calm, present, open, spacious, I'm so sorry your loved one has died, and just let that land, and let the explosion or the whatever of emotion or projection or anger or grief or sadness or confusion or denial or whatever it is that then erupts in the room, to be able to be very calm and hold the space for that. So in emergency medicine, you get very good at this sort of very, very rapid intentional state of mind switching from very extreme states of mind to one thing to another thing, right? And there's lots of other examples of situations in which you need to do that very, very quickly, but it gives you a sort of a fluency or a fluidity, a capacity to shift and to be very, very aware of your own mode. Like the other thing is, in emergency medicine, if you're not aware of what's happening on this side, you'll miss a lot of what's happening on that side, because this side actually gives you a lot of clues to that side. So like subtle intuitions, subtle senses of nervousness, subtle gut feelings, like the intuitive physicians who like something in their gut, they're like, something about that's a little off. Like
Mhm.
those are the ones who really save a lot more lives,
Mhm.
right? And they pick up stuff, and they oh no, that person's actually being like trafficked, or that person's actually being, you know, like, oh no, wait, that's not just ordinary chest pain, that's their dissecting aortic aneurysm or whatever it is. That somehow you get a spidey sense and an intuition that's very useful just in general for life. And you also get
Mhm.
to read people. You get
Yeah.
to basically, you have about 30 seconds to figure out if a person's a psychopath or borderline or whatever it is, or you're going to get run over by them. And so you
Mhm.
get a very, very fast radar for people. And that doesn't mean it's always perfectly accurate, but it does get a lot better.
Mm.
And so that some of those capacities, sorry, I've been talking on and on. There's still a
No,
lot of
that's
emotional charge from my ER days there. You sounded
no, no,
healed.
no. I find it fascinating. On my mother's side of the family, we have a lot of medical professionals, so I have a great deal of respect for the discipline of medicine. I think it's incredible what people do. But um, did you find, because in the medical world, from my own experience, with my family, they can become very set in their ways, let's say, about anything spiritual, that sort of thing. They don't seem to. They seem to, the institution, at least, of medicine, seems to be very incompatible with the, let's call it, institution of spirituality at times. So, how did you kind of square that circle?
Well, I want to say that I didn't, but that's not really true. So the first answer is that I hyper compartmentalized,
Mhm.
right? There was medical Daniel and there was magical meditative Daniel, and they really didn't talk to each other.
Mhm.
Except that that's not true. So
Mm.
the other thing is, if you hang out with nurses, and there are doctors who do this too, but more nurses will tell you stories about all kinds of wild stuff happening, particularly ICU nurses, ER nurses, nurses where the sort of the veils are thinner between life and death, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
um, Fascinating stories about shared crossings of when people die and people coming back, and you get to talk to people who had real NDEs, right? Where what was happening to them, where we coded them, like those those things are real. And sometimes the stories that people will tell are just like mind-boggling.
Mhm.
You know, this person had no pulse, they had no blood pressure, they had no anything, and they could tell you things about that they couldn't even see from their vantage point, like
Mhm.
about stuff that was happening around them, or very, very hard to explain stuff. So that's, and there's a whole literature on that. Just check out the NDE literature, near death experience literature. It's fascinating. But also stuff about ghosts and spirits and energy and healing and subtle intuitions and medical intuitives and all kinds of other stuff. So there is this parallel culture where you recognize weird stuff is going on, and there are people who are more in tune with it, and they usually find each other. So like the nurses and doctors who are on this magical side usually end up finding each other and talking to each other, sort of in back rooms or private meetings with each other about this kind of thing. And then you have the front, which is all, we are very normal here.
Mhm.
But medicine is not normal for anybody who's been in it, right? The world is not normal. Humanity is not normal, and life and death are not normal in the way institutions want to whitewash them.
Mhm.
But of course, I understand why the C-suite wants and lawyers want to present a very normal front. Of course, they do.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Did you ever find yourself applying any of your kind of meditation practices in the emergency room? Like kind of.
yeah. So I'll give an example. Um, and this was not common. So to imagine I was doing this all the time, no. See, these are the exceptions, not the rules. Most of my day to day was pretty garden variety emergency medicine.
Mhm.
But I'll give you one example. So there was a patient who had come in, and they had gained a lot of weight very rapidly over a year. Like
Mhm.
started out like I don't know if you do pounds, right? So
Mhm.
120 pounds and ended up like 220 pounds over a year, and they were only like 5'3".
Oh, that's big. Yeah,
So, and this
that's a
is,
lot.
and they came in with all this knee pain and all this back pain and all this hip pain, and it's like a 5'3" frame is not designed to handle 220 pounds.
Mhm.
Like, and I just basically said that kind of straightforwardly, like physically, the physics isn't going to work on this,
Mhm.
and that's going to be your first thing you change. They had gone from a job where they were working a lot to a job where they were sitting at a desk, basically drinking soda all day, and it
Mhm.
just was terrible for their health. And their initial reaction to that was explosive. And I have this, so sometimes sort of have this neuroatypical bluntness and straightforward, just I'm trying to give you helpful information. I don't think someone's going to take it personally. They initially took it extraordinarily personally and basically erupted. Why are you saying blah, blah, like, you're calling me this and you saying that? Just like, okay. Now, at the moment they did that, I suddenly saw and felt this sphere of black, like sort of weird, strange energy coming at me. Like, and I could feel it moving through the room and see it like radiating out from the patient. And when it hit me, I could tell I could pretty much have a choice of reactions to it. And the reaction I chose was equanimous transparency. And I could feel this creepy energy wave like moving through my body, and I could see it. So I'm not much of a see stuff person in the ER kind of, but this day I was. And I could feel it like shuddering through me, and it felt like a wave of poison, like just a wave of energetic poison. It's like, okay, do not fight it, do not resist it, just let her explode. And literally the second it finished, this sort of shockwave of nastiness passed through my body, and I hadn't resisted it, and I had sat there calmly and kindly just listening and appreciating the person in front of me. Literally the second it finished passing through me, they all of a sudden stopped and kind of startled and saying, what am I saying? You're totally right. You were just trying to give me helpful advice. I'm so sorry that I erupted at that. Yes, of course, I should stop drinking all the soda and should get more exercise and lose weight. Thank you, doctor. I'm sorry. I just was so angry. And the timing of it and the feel of it and like the choice of like how I react to this all seemed very magical at the time. Anyway, so that's one of only a relatively small handful of examples I could give.
Yeah, I imagine with all that energy in a in that sort of situation, you must experience some stuff. You've got death kind of experiences. You've got like pain. You've got every kind of a smorgasbord of different kinds of energy in a medical practice, haven't you? So stuff like that must happen. I mean, that's the way I look at it. But so when I think,
or a few times where I just knew diagnoses that it doesn't make any sense. I knew like that something was going horribly wrong when there was no obvious sense of it.
Right.
I got saved a few times by just, oh, wait, something is horrible here. And the nurses were like, how could you tell something's horrible? I'm like, I can just tell. Don't know. Can't explain it, but something's horribly wrong. And then, yes, something was horribly wrong.
Sort of intuition.
So that weird pattern matching that I couldn't tell you how it happened.
Yeah. So I think, obviously, I want to talk to you a bit more about magic as well coming up. But first of all, I can't have Daniel Ingram on a podcast and not preach the subject of enlightenment with you. I mean, this is it became your kind of your thing for quite a while, didn't it? It was always
Still is.
Yeah. I mean, yes, but it was very much. It almost became slightly controversial at one point as well.
It's still extremely controversial. There's a whole cadre of. I have a dedicated group of people who work to oppose all of my scientific articles and my neuroscience and my everything I do. They're told me to my face that they're actively trying to destroy my reputation, make sure nobody believes me, and they have whatever academic and political power that they have, and they do what they do, and there's 8 worldly winds blow him personally as always, praise and blame, fame and ill repute.
Oh well, but let's talk about enlightenment. If someone's, I mean, this is going to be such a broad question, and I apologize in advance, but if someone asks you what is enlightenment, what how would you answer them?
So the first thing I would say is a lot of people mean a lot of different things by that word. Right. And that's okay, as long as people are explaining what they mean by that word. I go into elaborate detail in this in chapter 37 of Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha, which you can find online for free at mctb.org. But what do I mean? So there's a lot of ways to look at that question, even within Buddhism. And even within the Theravada, which is a particular strain of a very old particular strain of Buddhism. And but all of those caveats and disclaimers and stuff aside, I'll begin with saying it's something that is very straightforward, is very literal, is very immediate, and involves a sort of a natural appreciation of everything knowing itself where it is. So the sensations of this glass are where they are. The sensations that pretend to be observing it are somewhere in here. These are just sensations. These are just sensations. They're all occurring now. They're all very natural and straightforward. They are all very transient, have an ephemerality to them. They all have sort of something of I'll call a luminosity to them. That doesn't mean an additional glow or something, but it means they contain their own light of awareness sort of within them. That everything that's pretending to be an observer or a subject or a doer, a knower, a watcher, a controller, a stable, continuous beer, something that is and still is and still is the continuity. Like I've been saying, oh, Daniel this and Daniel that, like all the Daniels we've along the way. Like sort of think of that as one Daniel, right? I'm still Daniel. I was Daniel then. I was Daniel now. Well, experientially, that is not true. Right? Experientially, the sensations are fresh and immediate and changing all the time. And so it's a very direct, natural, kind of eventually hardwired, non-reflective appreciation of that. And that doesn't sound very interesting, although it is, having experienced life the one way and the other way, I can tell you this is better. And then the other analogy I use a lot for this is something called the rope and the snake, which is a traditional analogy out of Buddhism. And it's basically you're walking along a jungle path at twilight or something, and maybe the light's not very good, and all of a sudden you see a snake in the path, right? And it's the jungle, so snakes can be very dangerous. You jump back, your heart, and you have this, it's a snake, and then it's not moving. Wait a second, is that a? And you go closer and you look. Oh no, that's actually an old piece of rope, and the braided pattern in the light and with my startling convinced my whole body and the whole system of me that it was a snake. And in that instant, there's a shift, right? And that rope snake shift, that sort of existential pre-processing what it isness shift, once you've seen that it's a rope, you can't see it as a snake, right? In the same way, that can happen with all of the things we think of as our sort of stable, separate, observing, controlling, knowing, doing, being self. All of the sensations in the head and the sense of intentions arising before actions and the sense of knowledge arising after sensations, all of those are just natural qualities. Intentions arise naturally, energy, the quality of will, the quality of things happening on their own, the quality of decisions happening, the quality of stuff just spontaneously happening, causally or mechanically or whatever. Those are all just qualities that arise and disappear. And there's this sort of quality of non-graspingness. So this is talked a lot about in Buddhism. It's a very confusing term. What does grasping mean? But the sort of snake, this is a stake, meaning this is a self brain, thinks, oh, this is the Daniel, this is the Daniel, this is the Daniel, this is the Daniel, this is the observer, this is the observer, this is the observer, this is the observer, this is the controller, this is the controller, this is the controller, this is the controller, this is the continuity, this is the agent, this is the thing. And it takes all these little sensations that are occurring one after the other, and it builds a snake story out of them. These are still the snake. These are still the self. This is still the continuous Daniel. And at some point, it can, usually by degrees and in layers, it can stop doing that. And it turns out it didn't need to do that. And it turns out if you don't do that, you still function fine. In fact, I think you function better. And it turns out that was just like a mind virus of extra processing bullshit the brain didn't need to do and doesn't hold up under really good scrutiny as being true or useful. And then once the brain finally stops doing it, it just happens to feel a whole lot better. And you can call that enlightenment or not, but it is a mod, like a perceptual, existential, interpretive mod that you can do. And you could do it in layers and by degrees and see glimpses of it and hints of it along the way. In fact, the first time anybody ever sat down to meditate, they almost certainly saw all the components of this right then. So you saw your thoughts come and go. You couldn't control them. You couldn't really figure out what this observer thing was. It seemed to be your eyes and your head and your thoughts and your images of yourself, and it's totally incoherent. And then the brain rejects all of the insights you got the first time you ever tried to meditate and says, no, I must be in control. I must be a self. I must somehow, there's a way that I can grab the reins of this thing and I can be a stable, peaceful thing that controls this reality and this brain and this heart, mind, body thing. Good luck with that. Nobody ever actually achieves that. You can sort of achieve some illusions of more control and more concentration and more stability, but those just actually arose causally. And so the distinction, it turns out, is important. And so realization is the eventual hardwiring of that into just everything sort of naturally knows that at some point. And again, you can just train to do this and then it can do it. Lots of different schools and systems, but something of that. And then those were sort of funny word non-dual, which is very easy to throw around and reify or get confused about. But I'll sort of describe it in negative terms. You do not find a true duality, which is there is a true stable observer, agent, controller, knower, beer. You can't find a stable that in experience. And you can't even actually find a stable unity in experience. It's too ephemeral. It's too shifty. It's too, like, the moment is too something. So you can't find anything to grasp. You can't find anything that could actually grasp it. And this whole sort of, I must be this, I must be that, figuring out that the brain feels it has to do doesn't have to happen. And you can actually stop that process. And then the brain doesn't do it anymore. And it's vastly nicer when it isn't doing it. It doesn't solve all your problems. There's still pain and the world is still irritating sometimes. People can be irritating. Life and death can be irritating. Sickness and all that can be irritating. But it's you're not adding that second arrow, as we call it, the more irritation to it than you needed to, of just the simple fact of having been born into this strange samsaric life.
I completely relate to what you were saying earlier about the sort of fidgeting mind that you get when you meditate. TM has a mantra method of kind of trying to bat that away as much as possible. I always find it's almost impossible to completely quieten that, for me anyway. But there are techniques, aren't there, in it? But yeah, that's interesting that you say that you kind of get a glimpse of enlightenment the moment you meditate.
Yeah. And those same components end up, weirdly enough, being the answer. So when there is nothing trying to be a separate controller, doer, knower, beer, and the whole thing is able to just sort of flow through itself, is a funny word, or just flow, really, because there's no itself to flow through. When the whole thing is just flowing and occurring naturally, that's what I call that. So
there's a great quote that I love, which I always get wrong, so I actually wrote it down, which is I've just moved it off my screen, which is, was it before enlightenment chop wood carry water, after enlightenment chop wood carry water? I'm sure you've heard that before.
I've actually been doing a lot of chopping wood. So yesterday was carpentry day. I got to chop a lot of wood into pieces and put them into places, and I actually have been carrying water out to the plant. So chopping wood and carrying water, both occurring.
But that seems, I love that, because it sort of explains my next question in a way, which is like, once you've kind of reached this level of enlightenment, what do you do with it? Like how does one kind of how does one live as an enlightened being?
So the simple answer is the whole thing then is taking care of itself, because there is not this sense of a separate thing that needs to ask that question in quite that kind of way. Not that the sensations of questions like that might not arise and vanish naturally. They do. What do I do today? What's the most important? Like, what's valuable? The nice thing is, once the sort of quest for that thing that enlightenment satisfies is done, then the rest is all aesthetics. The rest is all the particulars. So enlightenment is a generic quality that applies to everything. Everything is impermanent, transient, natural, immediate, luminous, causal, interdependent, whatever you want to pick, your favorite terms you like. So that applies to everything. But then the specifics become the only game in town. So how do you skillfully choose the colors, the outfits, the words, the actions, the career, what do you do in that moment that helps? And it's not like you always have all the answers. You don't, because knowledge is still limited and local and causal. But the sense of the thing just knows what to do in a way it kind of always was. You were just actually pretending it was actually a snake. You were actually pretending it was a separate controlling thing. It wasn't even then, and it was still doing whatever it does. So at some point, the only thing left is the aesthetics. And then how do you most people sort of then find themselves oscillating between what I'll call the two poles of that question. And the first is one I like to call sage. And sage, think Lao Tzu. So Lao Tzu, right? He was disgusted with society and the rules and the politicians and the warlords and the stupid, greedy assholes who were crashing around China at the time, and said, I'm just going to walk out the gates of the city and be done with all this. I like, this is a stupid, greedy shit show of awful people doing terrible things to each other. I want none of it. I just want peace and tranquility. And he was walking out the gates, and the guard stopped him and said, oh, you have to write something down. I'm not going to let you out of the gates of the city. He's like, okay, I guess I'll write something down. Y'all have, and then he walked out and was never heard from again. Y'all have fun. See, you wouldn't want to be you. It's basically like, no, the world is a greedy, stupid shit show. Like, find a quiet, peaceful place. It's very Voltaire, like maybe cultivate a garden with a few friends. Very Candide. If you haven't read Candide, by the way, great book, still extremely relevant today. It's a good read. It moves along. It's short. Seems very modern in a lot of ways. So anyway, that's sage. And then Mage says, no, we are the people with wisdom and knowledge and tolerance for pain and some sort of appreciation of this thing that people can realize that does make a difference. And if not us, who? If not now, when? Who's going to actually help? Of course, we should be motivated. Think bodhisattvas, right? Like, we must be motivated to compassion to come back into the world and help these people. It's like the 10 ox herding pictures. We ride the ox back into the marketplace or something. It's that kind of thing. We go forth and we do try in our own flawed ways to try to help people appreciate the stuff and be kinder and nicer and better and whatever. Mm-hmm. So I find most people, there are some people who just kind of pick a side, right? And actually, weirdly enough, I know more people who have picked this side than this one. They're quiet about it. They're not making a big splash. They're not trying to do much in the world. They're not talking. They're not teaching. They're just living their lives with this kind of understanding in their own quiet way. Usually they make some positive difference, but I know more of these, oddly enough. And then you get the bodhisattvas who are out there fighting the good fight, saying the message and putting out their podcasts or whatever to save the world. So like, that's the bodhisattva. And most people I know actually end up oscillating. So they go on retreats and they get retreat, and then they come back, and then they do this for a while, and they get kind of disgusted and sort of, they're kind of going back and forth. They renew, they go charge again, they retreat, so it ends up being a sort of oscillatory thing, something like that.
Do you feel enlightenment, people often get certain things wrong about enlightenment? Like, for example...
Oh, all the time.
Like, from in my youth, I suppose, when I used to read about Buddhism, it always sounded like to reach a stage of enlightenment, you had to go through a great deal of a massive work, almost like a lifetime of work before you could.
Some do.
Yeah. That doesn't seem to always be the case, though. The more I read, it feels more like it's something that can be achieved obviously in different ways, but also, do you see where I'm kind of going with this? It feels like it doesn't have to be this kind of lifetime thing before you get there, if that makes sense. Like, would you agree with that? Or...
So absolutely. And if you go back to the original texts like the Pali Canon and you read the stories of the lives of the great followers of the Buddha back then, Sariputta and Moggallana and Ananda and all these people who are sort of the great heroes of early Buddhism. And you find, and the Buddha even said this, he said there are 4 types of people. He said there's those who move quickly and easily on the path, and those who move quickly and with difficulty, and then who move slowly, but easily, and then slowly and with difficulty, right? And so you get all 4 types of people, and you see those back then in the day. You saw some people who practiced with the Buddha for a very long time before they woke up, and some people, the Buddha just literally said a word or two to, and they woke up, or like a short sutta, like Bahia of the bark cloth, just a short set of phrases. And some people were very ripe and ready, and some people it took a long time, and some people never woke up. They continued to be faith followers, as they were called back then, that had tremendous faith in the teachings, but weren't able to realize them in their lifetime. And so, those stories obviously have their sort of mythic elements to them, but there's also a lot of humanity, a surprising amount of humanity mixed in as well. And particularly when you look at the Vinaya, which is the code of conduct for monks and nuns, and you look at all the stories behind all the 227 or 300 and whatever rules that they have, there's all these stories for why the rule came down. And you can tell the Sangha was extraordinarily human. These were mammals crashing around doing the things that mammals do. and just like we are today. And so you can feel that it has this sense of something very human, very real, very lived, very practical, and there is that range. And so but these techniques can work, like they are effective. These qualities right now are observable now. Again, it's the first thing most people ever saw when they tried to meditate, and they reject them. They spend most of the rest of their time rejecting the qualities of the three characteristics, as we would call them. That things change, that there's no one who can control that, and there's something irritating about that. Right? These are the source of wisdom of vipassana. Just nobody likes those. People want pleasant, peaceful things they can control. Right? They want to be a stable and control something's, realized amazing self or something.
Mm.
It's not what you find, but it's what people try for. And then eventually some give up and start going the other way, which is against the grain, as the Buddha called it. So
I've been reading a lot of
against the
Baudrillard.
stream.
Yeah, I've been reading a lot of Baudrillard recently, or Baudrillard. People pronounce his name differently. French philosopher. He talks a lot about simulation and simulacra, and it feels like you were talking earlier about how when you're enlightened, your brain realizes almost that it doesn't need to operate in the way it's been in this kind of over complicated way that it's operating. And it feels like Baudrillard, and maybe I'm blending this a bit because I've been reading a lot about Gnosticism recently as well, but there's this sort of like inclination I have that it almost feels like something's deliberately tricking the brain, or we're kind of almost tricking ourselves and wiring ourselves to we're sort of living in this kind of strange simulation, and maybe enlightenment is an awakening from this idea of simulation. By simulation I mean that we seem happy to eat fake versions of foods, and we seem to be moving further and further away from authentic experiences, and sort of replacing them with simulations of authenticity the whole time. And I wonder if enlightenment somehow allows us to see through that a little bit more than a non-enlightened brain, perhaps.
Well, I think it is certainly true that as you train in more psychosomatic clarity, right, you get a lot of people will start to notice, oh, when I eat this, I feel this, or my mood goes like this, or when I hang out with these kinds of people or do these kinds of activities, this is the effect it has on my heart, mind, body system. So I think any form of training where you're just sort of paying more attention to the causal consequences of various diets or various activities or various substances or various things we do to attempt to find happiness or distraction or joy, you get a more refined sense of what they actually do in the short, medium, and long term. And that, I think, helps inform better choices. So that isn't necessarily specific to awakening. I think it's just paying attention, which obviously is a good foundation for awakening and all kinds of other things. But so that's the first thing I think about that. The second thing regarding simulation, I'm going to use that as a little bit of a reach to ramp to a totally different but highly related topic, if that's okay.
That's absolutely fine.
And the question of simulation. So we do these things called Fire Kasina retreats, and Kasina, Kasina, is an old Pali word, and Pali is a language like Sanskrit that the original texts were written down in. And it basically is using an external object as an initial support for deep concentration. And so in this case, we often use a candle flame or a light, like you could use one of your studio lights, or that light right there would be quite fine for this, actually. It's a good sense. And basically you look at this for a few seconds if it's a really bright light, or a minute or so if it's like a candle. And then you close your eyes and you see some kind of after image. It's like usually like a dot or something that's kind of in the shape of the thing. It might be green or yellow or blue or red or whatever, depending on you and the thing you looked at. Usually for me, it's sort of red or yellow dot with a candle. And then it eventually will sort of move around and get rings around it and get staticky stuff and after images and become black or green or do other strange things, roll off to the side. It doesn't really matter. And you just pay attention to whatever it is you see. And then when you get bored, which might be a minute or an hour, you open your eyes and you look at the light source again, and you do that again. It turns out if you do that in really high dose, like 8, 12, 14, 16, 18 hours a day, and you do that for enough days, like think 10, 12, 14 days. So let's just say 100 to 150 hours of practice in a very short span of time in a conducive setting with all the appropriate warnings and safety guidelines, because this is not at all safe. Reality you can go through a series of stages, which involves some very weird and sometimes very challenging phases. And then eventually you get out to the other side, what we call out past the murk or powered up. That's the language we tend to use when we do these retreats. And when you get powered up, as we call it, suddenly reality becomes more and more malleable. You can draw your pentagrams in the air and feel and see the blue or amber or whatever flame color you chose, just like syrup on space, trailing into the air, and actually see your pentagrams in the LBRP, for example. And sometimes even other people can see them and even tell what color you drew them in. That actually happened with Duncan Barford. We were on a retreat, and I drew an amber pentagram in the air, and he was like, "Oh, you've just drawn an amber pentagram in the air." And that I had drawn a pentagram in the air was obvious. That I had drawn it in amber was not. I hadn't told people I was working in amber. So that's interesting. So you can even get these sort of shared visionary experiences, and reality become even more malleable than that. And so we have a stage we actually formally call malleable, and that's what the old texts call it, where you can kind of do anything. It's like a lucid dream, except you're here. So it seems. And at that point, the sort of ontological conclusion that this is a simulation, or that the brain is creating a set of experiences that are workable or changeable kind of any way you want, becomes very salient. In that sort of mode and frame of mind, that is a very reasonable way to look at reality, that it is all up for grabs, that it is all actually changeable, that you can actually turn your water glass into a rabbit or something, to use a somewhat absurd magical example. And that's your experience. And that might even be the experience of somebody else who's way up there in that strange space with you. Occasionally, you can have these sort of shared, verifiable magical experiences. You're both seeing whatever odd thing that other people normally wouldn't see or experience or hear or smell or even taste, feel, all possible. And so that brings up so I should mention I'm a strict ontologically agnostic empirical pragmatist. Just so that's clear. So what ontology meaning statements of what truly is. This is all a simulation, or this is all in the mind, or this is all the dream of the great god Vishnu, or this is all a universe of psi-square particle probability quantum fields resolving based on whatever consciousness is interacting with it, or something. You pick an ontology. I'm a strict ontological agnostic, meaning I actually don't know how you would firmly prove any of these. Although, being a pragmatist, I can, sort of being an empiricist, I should say, in the David Humean sense of the great, I guess he was Scottish, but British or UK islands empiricist. That sense that your experience is the first basis of all extrapolations. Right? And then empirically, that reproducibly, in that sense of scientific experiment, that meaning of empirical, you can see what kind of ontological frames improve or don't improve, or the risks and benefits, the pros and cons of various ways of interpreting reality. And then you can do that pragmatically. So when I say ontologically agnostic, empirical pragmatist, I mean, I make my choices about how I say what reality is. It's all a simulation, or it's all the mind of God, or it's all emptiness, or it's all the void, or it's all one, or whatever. I choose those based on my own experience of what I think is reproducibly useful, rather than having some fixed, oh, this is what it is. And that's very chaos magic, right? Bringing it back to the great chaos, and this sort of insight that you can take on and off these different frames, or these different systems, or these different worldviews, and see what they do. So I, in my heart of hearts, am really sort of a kind of a Buddhist chaos wizard, right? Because I like the fluidity that comes out of like some of the more advanced Buddhist philosophers, like Nagarjuna, however you say his name, I've heard various pronunciations, where like the sense of deconstructing philosophy itself, or even French Laruellians, where you can draw a line. Philosophy is like you make a decision to draw a line between a this and a that, and then you've created a problem you use philosophy to solve. But you can have a lot of choice in where you draw your lines and how you say what's on each side of your line. This is reality. This is not. This is a simulation. This is not. This is the mind. This is not. This is enlightenment. This is not. You can have a lot of fun with that and do that sort of with a consciousness of like, oh, there are choices, it seems, of how we do this.
I think Robert Anton Wilson used the expression, the map is not the territory, to describe that.
Absolutely. And also was fascinating, lots of ways to select different maps and ways you divide reality. Ken Wilber, same kind of idea. Yeah. This is not new, but I very much appreciate this sort of ontological, intellectual, existential flexibility when dealing with whatever I'm dealing with, being the biochemistry of medicine or the weird, and being able to flip very quickly between various frames of what's going to be helpful in this situation. Do I adopt a magical frame, a rationalist frame, a materialist frame, a cosmic consciousness frame, a Wiccan frame, or whatever frame I'm looking at, and or something, and what's going to be interesting and what are the options? I find that really fun.
So looking at some Buddhist concepts, maybe from a more magical perspective, would the dark night equate to the abyss in terms of?
I think so. I think there are a lot of good arguments to be made for making that equation. So here's what you gain. So again, I'm sort of a risk benefits alternatives, RBAs.
We should maybe mention what the dark night is as well.
So the dark night. Okay, yeah. So what's the dark night? So that's a term that comes out of the Catholic mystics, particularly this book, The Dark Night of the Soul, by St. John of the Cross. But it's a very old concept. And so if you look in Buddhism, there's been a tendency in the West, of the syncretic West, to put together and say the dark night of the Christians is the same as the knowledges of suffering as Buddhism, is the same as the nafs and the lung disorders of whatever Tibetan traditions, is the same as the jinn attacks of the Sufis, or is the same as the there are all these different sort of, if you look across the traditions. I actually have a study right now. The Templeton Religious Trust gave my charity Emergence Benefactors and a group of us a bunch of money to actually study, is there an arc of insight? And the arc of insight we're looking for evidence for or against is, do you have this big opening, which I would call like an arising and passing away event, or some people call it a Kundalini opening or initiation, or your first, this is Christians who have been born again, their conversion experience, they're touched by the Spirit. They're, it's usually very up, light, energetic, can be very wild, sometimes very challenging, by lightning strikes in your spine and first magical experiences or whatever. And then after that, you go on the hero's journey, is what Joseph Campbell called it, right? Where you have your initial thing, and then you enter the underworld, right? You enter the challenging. There's something has started, and then the process is going to go through on the sort of whole human tour of all the aspects of ourselves. We get to go down the Jungian, the archetypal world, the challenging world, and it may have ordinary manifestations like depression or anxiety, or very weird manifestations like demons crawling through our spine or whatever, or very, who knows what might have, or the sense of temptation or challenge or being forsaken by God, or wait, this doesn't work. We call it the murk and Fire Kasina terms. So if you go to our website, we'll talk a lot about the murk, which is where you get these cool initial things, and then everything turns into dark, staticky, irritating garbage for like 50 hours or 100 hours of practice. It can be very challenging to get through. But then on the other side of that, there's this notion of, you get to, like in Buddhism, they would call it the stages of equanimity or awakening, or you might call it, connecting to the divine, or finding Christ consciousness, or the nafs. If you look at the Sufis, if you look in the Sufi books like Ibn al-Arabi's Journey to the Lord of Power, you'll find all kinds of fascinating descriptions of connections to the friend, or in Rumi or whatever. You can look at Rabia too. Some of these very deep mystics. Kabir is another fun one where you find these sorts of patterns. And so you can see there's a sort of journey. And then if you look at the Kabbalistic tree of life, right? So this is what you were talking about with the abyss, right? So if it is very tempting for me to very straightforwardly and with a pretty high degree of confidence say Tiferet A and P, right? So it's like sort of shining light in the center with the cool stuff. and then to say absolute or whatever the you know, I'm totally mispronounce these. Forgive me, whoever has ideas about how you pronounce the top three,
I'm
Chokmah,
terrible with
Banan, and
pronunciation, don't worry.
Keter or whatever. Like I'm awful. Like sorry, apologies. You know, and then you have like the sense that in between the two is the abyss, Dath, Charanzan, right between the lower Sephiroth and the higher absolute or whatever. And so that is very, very tempting from my point of view to say, yeah, of course that's the dark night. Of course that's the obvious place where you find this thing in this pattern. Doesn't mean it is, but I can make good arguments for why, from a sort of a pattern recognition point of view, it's nearly impossible not to sort of equate the two, particularly as people do magical practices and have these big openings and then crash. Right, or people go on these, you know, and that's what you see again and again. And that was one of the more striking things, that this pattern repeats itself again and again. So over 30 years of talking to people, I got to hear just people describe the same pattern. It felt like to me again and again, with some variants and some differences and some cyclic fractal sort of things of going back through it round and around, this sort of vortexy kind of gyre or whatever patterns. But it looks all like the same thing to me. So that's just sort of the part of my side that likes to lump all of these things into one. You know, the lumper side of me says, oh yeah. And then there's another side of me. It's like, yeah, but this. I can find all the inconsistencies and the subtle phenomenological differences and the epistemic and ontological and soteriological complexities, and soteriology being, for those not familiar with these kinds of terms, doctrines of salvation. What do you get saved from and by? You know, yeah, the soteriological subtle differences are sometimes glaring differences of what they think the outcomes are and how this all looks and what's the other side look like, and the advertisements for their own path as being better than all the other paths or the true path or whatever. So I can make the argument both ways, but yes, I equate the dark night and the abyss. It's the short answer.
So it feels to me, from the reading I've done about Buddhism, one of the big intersections between magic, at least Western esoteric tradition, or Western esoteric traditional magic, I suppose you could say, and Buddhism, the first thing that really grabbed me was this idea of entities that you seem to encounter with within Buddhism. They seem to, again, not wanting to do what we were just talking about, that there does seem to be a bit of a overlap there as well, doesn't there?
Oh yeah. So Buddhism is chock-a-block full of entities and realms and various types of things. You've got your 6 realms, you got your hell beings, right? And you've got your hungry ghosts, which are like constantly like craving things. And you've got your animal realm, which is kind of stupid and sort of like repetitive or kind of limited. And then you've got your human realm, which has this fascinating balance of some magic and intelligence and capabilities, but not too many distractions, like and not too much pain necessarily. It can be kind of hellish though. And then you've got your asura realm, which is the realm of the it's often translated as like titans or jealous gods. Think Greek gods, Norse gods. They're very anthropomorphized. They're very powerful. They're very beautiful. They live a very long time, and they get into all kinds of trouble, like lots of drama over power and sex and whatever, the usual stuff. You know, think oligarchs as the human example. Think these people crashing around the world, causing a lot of big drama. And then you've got the higher long-lived gods, the Devas, that are far above all of this stuff and think they're immortal, but really are actually immortal, live a long time, have a lot of power, but they're not really mostly engaged with most of the drama of what's going on below them. So very serene and very high up there. So, and then you've got all kinds of other entities that don't necessarily fit in these. You've got nagas and garudas and these sort of bird creatures and snake creatures. And you've got all kinds of demons and forest spirits and all this broad reach of animism. And within all of the different categories of beings, you've got all these other things. So you've got ghosts and you've got, yeah, so it's a very rich pantheon. It can kind of end up looking a bit like the list demons, you know, or some of these, you know, and they all have their personalities and their quirks and their big lists of the different realms that these things inhabit, the 33 realms of existence, which sort of break down into sub-bands, each of those other categories, the different layers of hell, the god realms, or all of that, and Pure Land realms, etc. And so it does end up looking a lot like some of the magical traditions. And then certainly through these practices, and sometimes not through these practices, you can hear things, see things, have full-on like three-dimensional, like lived, like as strong as a lucid dream or as strong as a travel interactions with these kinds of entities occasionally. Much more likely if you're doing a high intensity concentration practice like Fire Kasina, which you can find all kinds of stuff out about at firekasina.org. So you can go there, you can find all our warnings, lots of reports. This is dangerous. It's not the first talk I give on these retreats is this is not safe. We don't know how to make it entirely safe. Those warnings are real. We've learned the hard way. So try to learn the easier way from our mistakes and advice. Yeah, so there is this sense of parallel, and you can end up with people getting like the sense of that the spirit has come into them, that they have now become a goddess or whatever, that they're being bothered by these things, that these interactions can take on all the qualities they do in the magical traditions as well. All the then questions of demons and exorcisms and angels and protector spirits and agents and servitors, and that all the same ports over.
So do you feel, I assume you've had experiences with entities then. So do you feel that this is a big question, I suppose. Do you feel that they're objectively real, or do you feel, because this is the big question often within magic, isn't it? It's is Lon Milo Ducat, for example, a fairly well regarded Thelemic author and practitioner,
yeah,
says,
I've got a number of his books. I really appreciate his sort of down-to-earth pragmatism.
Yeah, and he always says it's all in your head. You just have no idea how big your head is, which I thought was a really great way of putting it. But
so remember, I'm a strict ontologically agnostic, empirical pragmatist. So when dealing with an entity, there's a whole lot of moves you can do, and the first ones are ontological. Right? Is this real? Is this not real? Is this a figment of my imagination? Is this just colors and sounds? Is this a manifestation of my own internal psyche? Like, is this an archetype manifesting, which sort of bridges that divide? Like the archetypal part of me is manifesting in the world as a bigger archetypal thing that it's sort of platonic, ideally a part of or something. Is this thing benign? Is it workable? Is it not? And that first sort of ontological move, which one can make consciously, has its pros and cons, right? So it's likely to go differently depending on the ontological choice you first make. Do you say this is absolutely a thing and it deserves rights and we should be, or is this absolutely a thing and it has no rights and I should command and control it and Solomonic, whatever? Or is this something that deserves compassion and I can teach it the Dhamma? Is this something that is workable? Is this something that I can communicate with? Is this something I can transmute? Like in a tantric sense, I can turn this demon into a servitor or a pet or an enlightened aspect of myself. So that first ontological move opens some doors and closes others. Now, that doesn't mean we always actually get to make that as much as we would like to at the rope snake level. So the problem is sometimes we really think the rope is a snake. And sometimes we really think the snake is a rope. And how do you know? I don't know how you absolutely know. But our emotional body, our psychological body is making that decision, even if our intellect is discordant. So you can get these sides of yourselves, like from a sort of a parts work point of view, because I'm going to bring in parts now, because or do I IFS this? Do I go like internal family systems and start applying internal family systems framework to that, which weirdly enough at the deep end actually go into the realms of these are demons, these are are these actually aspects of yourselves, right? Because IFS can get quite strange in its sort of deeper esoteric aspects. And do we actually get to make those decisions fully? So even if I intellectually decide, oh, this is just like colors and sensations arising and vanishing, I go the Vipassana route, or this is totally not real and I'm just going to attempt to ignore this, that doesn't mean whatever our experience of the entity is going to play along. We might continue to see it. We might continue to hear the voice. We might continue to feel the energy of it. We might continue to see in the world what appear to be real world effects of it. Right. So that question as a first question is an important one. And how much control do you actually have of your real answer?
Yeah.
Seems to vary. Right. But I can definitely tell you, if you're able to have a range of answers and actually implement them, it is likely to go better than I purely take this as totally real all the time, and I relate to if it is absolutely real with all the power it says it has and able to do all of the implications of it being whatever entity it seems to be. If you've been in magical orders long enough, you've gotten to see the pros and cons of the various ways people relate to these things.
Yeah, it's one of
right.
It's definitely a dividing line between people, isn't it? A lot of the time, the
Mm-hmm.
kind of concept of reality, I suppose. It's yeah, I don't know. I would say I used to be very on the it's all in your head until the experience I mentioned to you before.
Mm-hmm.
And now,
And you get those sometimes unstoppable ontological or epistemic shifts
Mhm.
where, because of an experience that you had, now you rope snake level an interpretation. Okay, wait a second. That is categorically, structurally, emotionally something else. That shifted what you believe is possible in terms of entities and their relationship to them in a way that you didn't get a choice in that. That was just what happened. There
Mhm.
was a shift. And when that happens, like through DMT, a lot of people, DMT entities can be very
Mhm.
compelling. There's a whole massive literature on this, for example.
Mhm.
What
They're
are the
mapping the
machine
realm,
elves?
aren't they?
What
Yeah.
are the hyperfractal eye-covered lizard people, or whatever what are these things, right?
Mhm.
But they can feel vibrantly, viscerally, intelligently real.
Mhm.
And not everybody is prepared for that, and not everybody can fully intellectually dismiss that. Or when it happens off the context of a substance, right? Even if you're on DMT, you can say it was just the DMT.
Mm.
It's harder to do that on like a Fire Kasina retreat, where you're not on a drug, you're just paying attention to lights on your eyelids. And then all of a sudden you can have an experience that is as potent as a DMT entity experience, or experience you had, where it does cause that level of visceral ontological shift and shock.
Mhm. Yeah.
Those are things, and you need to be prepared for that. That the pure defense of this is all illusion or hallucination, or just something my mind vomited up today, right?
Yeah.
You don't always get that full ontological choice, and you
Mhm.
need to go in prepared for that possibility that you might suddenly viscerally deeply believe something is real and not be able to change that easily.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, even things like pranayama can do that to you, can't
Oh,
it? I
yeah.
mean, yeah,
And
it's
sometimes just life. I know plenty of
Mhm.
people who just started seeing entities and may have seen them since they were kids, or
Mm.
hearing them, or feeling them, or sensing them some other way.
I get this. I'm terrible with pronunciation. If you ever watch the show, I'm always being corrected. I'm happy to be corrected. Is the correct word Siddhi?
Iti,
SI? Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um, why?
That's the Sanskrit, or iti is the Pali.
Mm,
So the sense of powers, right?
mhm.
The powers is usually how that's translated. The
Yeah.
attainments, the experiences, yeah.
Why do so many teachers seem so reluctant to even discuss them? Like, why is that such a moot thing with so many teachers? Would you say?
The not very generous answer is a reasonable number of teachers have almost no experience with them.
Mm,
So in the same way that before, a lot of, like, I've talked to, and myself, like, tons of people, they're like super, super skeptical, and then they have an experience, and then they're on the other side of that. And then they need
mm,
to figure out how to relate to this in a different way. A lot
yeah.
of teachers just haven't had those experiences. Or if they had them, they dismissed them. I had a bunch of experiences, and then just somehow my materialist brain was able to win for a while and dismiss them. It's like, nah, that's just nutty. Daniel, don't go there. Right.
Mhm,
It did that move. And that move might have been very helpful as a defensive or protective or even magical move. It's a very potent magical thing to be able to ignore, to dismiss, to diminish. That, from a magical point of view, is powerful magic.
mhm,
Right, and maybe very skillful magic for defensive and not ready to handle it, not able to integrate it, protective. So it might be a great move. I'm not saying it is or isn't, but then you've got those who had those experiences and got fascinated by them. They got trapped in them, they got lost in them, where they saw their friends and their close colleagues, or even their teachers, comrades on the path, get seduced by, infatuated by, intoxicated by, glamored by these things and chasing them, and you got to see what that whole path can lead to. And it can sometimes lead to amazing things, real breakthroughs and the depths of concentration that allow one to see things clearly and heal and transform and grow and become re-enchanted. And as we all know, it can also lead to terrible outcomes, right? People being hospitalized, losing their mind and their jobs, their relationships. They're really having horrible outcomes or even ending their own lives or the lives of other people. So if you do this long enough, you get to see both sides of this. And then most mass market teachers are factory, like, the sort of factory assembly line will do a retreat for 120 people kind of teachers. Like, they just don't have the bandwidth to be dealing with that, right? Because it's complicated. It requires training. It requires elaborate support. People who start getting into this stuff, right? They are going to have their own pretty intense learning curve usually. Very few people coming up in contemporary secular culture or even a sort of a religious culture that's been stripped of this stuff are going to have the conceptual frameworks, the skill sets, the support structures to really handle a magical worldview skillfully and properly, right? That's hence the magical orders arising to help deal with that. And then the magical orders, you didn't want to drag on them, but as we all know, tend to have their non-trivial share of psychopaths and narcissists and exploitation and the usual power play bullshit.
Oh yes,
right. So as our friend went into elaborate detail about on your previous podcast. So Alan Chapman was being, I think, you could all read between the lines of what he was saying, right? So
yeah.
So, and that's all true. And so then the problem is the ideal situation where someone comes into this stuff with enough support, with enough frameworks, with enough of a sense of humor and a sense of spaciousness and equanimity and wisdom and common sense in the face of these things, and enough theory and enough skillful guidance to develop it in a situation that's non-exploitative or doesn't have the usual petty power bullshit or the weird sexual, energetic, bizarre things that can happen sometimes in that territory, the curious exchanges between people and the all of that. Like, how often does it actually happen that a person coming into those kinds of experiences gets the ideal situation that we would all want for everybody who comes into those experiences? Almost never, right? So like, would you want to send somebody into that? Like, ethically, honestly, would you want to support that? Like, I don't know. And then even the people who come into this and they really are pretty good at it, and they do have a lot of background, and they've got a lot of mental, meditative, psychological, ego strength chops in the ordinary sense. They've got a lot of coping skills. They've got a lot of maturity, and they've got cool frameworks, and they've found whatever neat perspectives and ontological whatevers and all of that. Even then, a non-trivial number of my friends who are actually the rare ones who actually had all of that, which is almost none actually, but even with all of that, plenty of people will later say no. Like, would you really want to live in Harry Potter? Like, would you want to live in that universe? Look at it. Like, watch the Harry Potter movies or read the books asking that question. Would you rather live in the Muggleverse or the Magicverse?
Yeah.
Most people, even in the face of real experiences, eventually choose mostly the Muggleverse. They start detuning from the magic. They start not doing the magical practices they prefer, just like the wisdom or the kindness or the equanimity or some of the pure insight stuff. And the sort of dramatic world of magic, which has its charge and its glory and its amazingness and also its serious fuckery, and it's very confusing and it's like time consuming and it's like, oh my God. Like, I'll give an example. So like you were talking about entities. So I come home one night from the emergency department, and it's like, I can't remember, it's like fifth or sixth shift in a row, and I'm just exhausted. And I crawl up to my little windowless attic room where I can sleep in the daytime and it's dark. And I turn on the light, and there on my bed is this sort of bird creature. It's like maybe 60% transparent, but not fully. And it's got this elaborate sort of multicolored garment on. It's got its beak, and it's just laying in my bed, smiling at me as much as a bird creature with a beak can smile at you. But there's this sense of just kind of like happy there. And I just have no energy. I'm totally wiped out. I'm totally exhausted. And I basically just make the decision, I'm sorry, I don't know what this opportunity is, what this magical thing you're offering is. I got nothing. I'm totally fried. And I just literally like lay down in the space where it was, and I could see it as I was laying down in this thing, like it's on my bed and I need to go to sleep. And then it just sort of vanished and I just fell asleep. But I was like, I just didn't have the bandwidth to deal with whatever bit of magical whatever was going to happen at that moment. I was just totally toasted. And so it's like, yeah, and that is a sort of a nice version of why people might not want to live in a magical world.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so I think a lot of teachers understand that, even if they haven't themselves gone all the way through that journey to get to that kind of point. You can kind of TLDR it and say, yeah, magic, really? Like, don't want to deal with it. So that's a short answer. There's probably a much longer answer. I don't know if that was that short. But, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on all that? Does that resonate at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think taking breaks is essential sometimes.
Sure.
Otherwise, I think you'll go quite mad at times if you,
People
if you
do.
don't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly probably dwelled too long in that state in my own, experience sometimes, and regretted it deeply afterwards, because it's completely, it can completely send your life on a tailspin you don't necessarily want to go on sometimes. And
Absolutely.
yeah. So I think sort of restraint can be a powerful thing sometimes, can't it?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, just say no, or when to say no, or like, as I say with people in magic, you need to know how to turn it on and shut it off. It's an extension of the never summon anything you can't banish kind of idea, right? Same.
Yeah. Someone should have told the next person I was going to ask you about. What's your theory, your take on Aleister Crowley as someone that...
Wow. Okay, so I'm no serious Crowley expert, and I watched some of your previous podcasts, and you've had people on who are serious experts, right? They've read all of the Equinox, whatever. They like, they've been through all the stuff. I have maybe read and studied 10 or 15 books, the usual stuff. Book 4, Magic Without Tears, 777, the Book of Lies, of course, the Book of the Law, Moonchild, and I don't know, like there's a few others, and read some articles and heard a whole bunch of people talk about Crowley, right? He comes up a lot in these kinds of circles. But I'm like very mid. I'm going to be very, very mid for this podcast. And you're going to have so I apologize in advance. Right.
That's fine.
So, right. So but what I will say from my point of view is that you can see the obvious genius, right? This is an obvious genius. You can see someone who is an obvious performer and an obvious narcissist, straightforwardly. You can see the psychopathic aspects. You can see the good aspects as well. You can see the maturation process toward the later Taoist stuff. You can see the fascination and the mistakes. You can see the heavy, very late Victorian British overlay. These are not profound statements. Sorry, again, I'm disappointing. The thing that I'm struck by again and again is, even as there's sort of a gloss of ethics and an attempt at ethics, it doesn't have the Buddhist thing of deep, deep, deep emphasis on compassion, kindness, skillful speech, skillful action, non-harming ethic, right? So that, even though it's not like Crowley, however you pronounce it, Crowley. We say Crowley over here, you say Crowley over there, which is obviously the correct way. Sorry about that too.
That's okay.
You see, it's not like he doesn't talk about ethics. He does, and staying on the good, and the white brotherhood, like being a good wizard versus a bad wizard. That's in there, but there's something missing about that, or flawed, or broken, or corrupted, that I think is pretty obvious. That said, there's stuff you find in him that is hard to find anywhere else. There's a depth and a power in that of someone who took it so far and really took it so seriously, and attempted to wrestle with how to put this together into something and bring things together. So tremendous respect, tremendous trepidation, tremendous, there's like a sadness there's a tragedy for me in Crowley. Like, something is a tragic hero figure. It's a dark comedy. I don't know. These are my impressions. How much of that resonates with you, and what are your thoughts?
I think it's rare for someone from that period of time to have had for us to have such a snapshot of someone like
Oh,
that,
yeah.
if that makes sense. Like, because we have his diaries, we have, you know, other people's accounts, we have his writings, all that kind of thing. So I think he kind of gets judged a little bit more than an average person in some ways, doesn't he? Because
True.
we've got such a sort of slice of his life, you know, in text form, I suppose.
And things like Diary of a Drug Fiend, which apparently
Mhm.
was written to train police officers and stuff, like how to relate to
Mhm.
people who have addiction stuff, which is,
Mhm.
you know, there's a certain voyeuristic or exhibitionist quality, and
Mhm.
there's a certain, you can tell he wants people to know, like someone who wants to really be seen and have the humanity and the darkness of people be seen, right?
Mhm.
So in terms of someone who clearly was not afraid of the shadows and not afraid of the dark, well, I have a tremendous amount of respect for that.
Mhm.
And yet you can also see the cost
Mm.
for that is extremely high.
Yeah,
So
I think with Crowley, you have to acknowledge the shades of grey. I think that's
mhm.
the way I look at him anyway. It's like,
Or the
yeah,
extremely wide spectrum. Like
mhm.
he's got a much wider spectrum than most,
Yeah,
both
yeah, yeah.
sides of the equation.
Yeah, it's difficult to say, well, Crowley was this or Crowley. I mean, a lot of people go these days, oh, Crowley was, you know, this incredible racist. But at the same time, Crowley also went on black rights marches, and you know, which is very unusual for a gentleman of his period. You know, all this kind of stuff. So there is this kind of bizarre. He seems to contradict himself constantly. He's one of the, you know, he's very human in some ways. You know,
I agree. Extremely
yeah.
human. Because we
Mm,
contradict ourselves, right?
mhm,
If you lined up all of our internal parts, as the IFS people will, or the, you know, the parts work people will point out, like we're incredibly you know, so I contradict myself very well. I contradict myself. I contain multitudes. I misquoted
mhm,
that, but you get the idea.
mhm.
Yeah, it's important. And I appreciate someone who's willing to be that honest.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's yeah, yeah. So I
Even with the
always
obvious deceptions mixed in, right? Like
yeah.
it's funny.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean sometimes those deceptions are there for a reason though as well with
Sure.
Crowley. I mean the one that always comes up is I think we brought this up on the show a bunch of times, but the every day I kill a million babies. I got that completely misquoted, but he's clearly talking about masturbation, and you know, a lot of the conspiracy theory often uses that as proof that Crowley used to murder babies, but actually it was just to stop himself from getting prosecuted, you know, because of the decency laws at the time and things like that. But yeah, he's definitely he's a fascinating character. I mean, I can't escape him, especially doing this show.
Right.
He comes up almost every episode.
And anybody who thinks they're escaping him and is in any way involved in the New Age, in any way involved in any of the spin-off traditions, anything Gardnerian, anything like, you're doing something that is in the lineage of Crowley. Have a nice day, right?
Yeah.
There's no way around it.
Hmm. Even Scientology, you know,
Sure.
there's elements of Scientology that are influenced by. You can see Crowley's fingerprints on, obviously, because
Mhm.
Hubbard was you know, active with an ATO lodge for a while. So yeah, it's yeah, he's. I think I've kind of come. I went through various phases with Crowley where, you know, I loved him originally. Then I found him. I couldn't stand the guy. Now I've come to this kind of middle ground now where I've acknowledged the flaws but recognized the genius, like you say.
And that's that same pattern. So the arising and passing away, dark night equanimity,
Yeah.
where it's the initial opening and initiation, and then the crash and the shadow, and then the spacious, open, expansive, equanimous ability to hold it all in some bigger, clearer, more balanced perspective, hopefully. Yep.
Mhm.
That's the pattern.
So I've seen you speak in the past as well. Do you consider yourself a chaos magician? Would you say?
My magical flavor is closest to chaos. Yeah, absolutely. And more, I think I'm more of a chaos magician than most chaos magicians, which is a totally ridiculously one-upsmanship sort of pretentious bullshit thing to say. But most of them are actually still do a lot of like Golden Dawnian, Crowleyan, like they're still highly influenced by a lot of the systems that in theory chaos magic. So like if you've got the spectrum from Coyote, who still does the LBRP and reads a lot of Crowley, and Coyote, like think Alan Chapman's Advanced Magic for Beginners, where you're just doing anything that could be anything.
Hmm.
I'm like here. right?
Mm.
So like I do almost none of this stuff, though I occasionally will look up a correspondence or whatever, but almost none of it. And then I also don't quite think that anything does anything most of the time. Like any spell could be done anyway, and it just doesn't really matter. So like I do think aesthetics are important. Like the same spell cast wearing a chicken, costume versus a black robe with, gloves with claws on a mountaintop with lightning striking around you, it's not going to be the same spell. Like I
Mhm.
just don't think so. So some of the trappings and aesthetics sort of matter, but not. I really don't follow anybody's systems at all. So like I find my own magical artifacts and make my own rituals and have my own correspondences, and the vast majority of it is incredibly spontaneous and just what feels like the right thing to do. And
Mhm.
all of my magical accoutrements, with a few rare exceptions, are, you wouldn't recognize them. You wouldn't know, oh, that's the this, that's the that. You wouldn't have any idea because they're not following anybody's system. So I'm like, kind of here-ish, if on that spectrum from follow everybody's rituals to advanced magic for beginners, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think didn't Duncan and Alan, they kind of started off as very deep into chaos magic and then realized that they were being more like traditional magicians, I suppose, didn't
Yeah.
they? I think that was
Yeah.
that was their.
Whereas I sort of went the other way. Well, I started off in
Yeah.
Buddhism and then I got into this and then I kind of ended up over here.
So, do you think belief itself functions as a magical tool in some way?
Belief is perhaps the most important magical tool.
Mhm.
So, and again, rope snake level belief, because there's different types
Mhm.
of belief, right? There's the belief that hits you in a way that is visceral, like is structural. Like I think that is actually the most important magical and insight related, awakening related tool.
Mhm.
So was that child on the table or whatever, the childlike figure that you saw real? Your body responded as if it was. You
Mhm.
now respond with a, wait a
Yeah.
second.
Yeah.
Right, that kind of structural belief, I'll call it, or existential, what is it really, belief that your body and your heart and your digestive system, or your hormones feel like the endocrine system feels. That's the belief that I think is the most important. And
Mhm.
there's intellectual belief, which is like that, and that's important too, and a very powerful tool. But the other one, right? You see what I mean?
Mhm. Yeah.
Like a friend of mine um, was on a beach and suddenly like saw like one of the palm trees or something suddenly became like a flaming thing with Jesus on the cross for them, like the real experience, and they suddenly became a super Catholic mystic like then.
Mhm.
Like that's the sort of shifts that yeah, that's the really powerful stuff.
Mm. Yeah, and it, like we were saying before, I think before we started rolling, often it can come from what seemingly the least meaningful. Well, what's the word I'm looking for? The from the place you least expect it to happen. Sometimes,
True.
like yeah, the smallest. I think you said like something about practicing something small regularly.
Yeah, I like simple
Mm.
techniques in high dose. Like
Yeah.
look at a light, close your eyes, follow the colors. Okay,
Mhm.
yeah, do 120 hours of that in 10 days.
Mhm.
or or 15 days or 17 days, which is what we like to do now. That's, I think, about the right arc of it. Um,
What What are your thoughts on synchronicities? Because this is another
oh,
one that's a big.
well, I'm delighted to have just done a podcast with Bernie Beitman,
Mm.
who studies synchronicities, and him and Sharon Roulette are both in the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium that I help organize and support. And they both formally study synchronicities. And I think
Mhm.
they're incredibly powerful. And I've had a lot of them. And so obviously a lot of my friends, and I'm sure most people watching this channel have probably had plenty. And they're fascinating because they speak to that level of meaning and myth making and connection and possibility and story and intelligence behind the scenes and omen and that side of ourselves that does not get very nourished a lot of the time in contemporary culture, but they do it in such a personal and sometimes quite surprising way. But I would check out, you might, if you like synchronicities, you might have Bernie Beitman on the
Oh yeah,
podcast. I
yeah,
don't know
definitely.
how much of a magical practitioner he is, but he can talk all day about all the types of synchronicities, and he studies this formally, and he's a very nice guy. So that might be fun. Yeah. What are your thoughts on them? Why do you raise the topic?
I've just been thinking about them a lot recently. There was I don't know if you saw it. There was a show that came out. I think everyone's waiting for the third season of it to drop, as they say. A show called Helia. It was
I don't know it.
It was a show. It's about a bunch of guys and a girl that go and they're trying to sort of track down initially a kind of paranormal mystery and then they go off on this kind of it's almost like a stream of consciousness, almost sort of a magical journey, with varying results, I'd say. I Yeah, people either it's very what we'd say in England, Marmite. People either really like it or really dislike it. But one thing that they seem to do in the show, I mean, they focus heavily on synchronicity throughout the show, and I was watching it again recently just because I was bored. I wanted to watch something, so I thought I'd watch Helia again, and it struck me that synchronicities can also be very trickstery in some ways.
Oh yes,
that sometimes
a
you
lot
can
of
get
the stuff can.
Yeah, you can sometimes pay a bit too much attention to synchronicities and go down a bit of it almost feels like a rabbit hole, or a kind of not a good rabbit hole though. Sometimes it feels like you're deliberately being led down the wrong path by synchronicities because you're placing too much meaning onto some of them, I think. And I think that the discerning magician almost, or the or practitioner or whatever, will learn how to pick which synchronicities are more valuable than others, I'd say. I don't know if you agree with that or not.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I have gotten so many messages, downloads, synchronicities, strange occurrences, that I totally could have endlessly followed up and gotten fascinated by. And I'm pretty happy, I think, that I've chosen to ignore nearly all of them. Certainly not all of them, but a lot of them. And I think that's been okay. Like, we do not have to take every opportunity for things to
No.
get slightly weirder, particularly when things may already be weird enough.
Have you come across this idea of this kind of trickster element within?
Oh gosh, yes.
Yeah. And what are your thoughts on this trickster element?
Wow. So coming from a Buddhist point of view, I often, and only slightly jokingly, and holding ontological agnosticism firmly in mind, will talk about Mara and becoming astounded. So Mara in Buddhism is the sort of personification of the world of suffering. And Mara, curiously enough, is actually one of the high gods that delights in the creation of others. And
Is it a snake?
Mara is a god, like a
Yeah.
person. Like usually, you get the sense this is an anthropomorphized god,
Yeah.
like sort of a human. Like when it comes down and
Oh,
talks
okay.
to the Buddha,
Interesting.
for example, and like
Mhm.
after the Buddha's awakening, Mara came down and said, "Okay, you've managed to escape my realm and wake up, but who would actually believe you?" Is the first temptation of the Buddha to keep silent. And Mara is a mixture of like sort of satanic figure, trickster figure, trapping people in the world of suffering, fascinating people, keeping them caught up in greed, hatred, and delusion. And so, at the root of Buddhism, weirdly enough, is a very potent trickster-like character. In the same way that Satan can be sort of thought of as a trickster-like figure in
Mhm.
Christianity, tempting people to the wrong paths or to the whatever. So I nearly every day mention something about, wow, this Mara is so good. I give them an A plus, because Mara is actually a position that, like, in the endless series of reincarnations that we would have all have had to beginningless time, we would have all spent many times in the position of Mara,
Mhm.
ruling a realm and being its lord of suffering and attachment and greed and hatred and delusion, and keeping people trapped in it, using our cunning and whatever to tempt people into not waking up. So I very much appreciate as a daily reflection the astounding capacity of this Mara to provide temptation, absurdity, complexity, confusion. It is mind-boggling when you begin to try to track all of the social factors and forces and immediate forces and factors down of all the choices we make and all the horrible decisions and all the devil's bargains, like all of the problems with contemporary life. And Buddhism at its most cynical would say all of this is the realm of Mara and suffering. We must free ourselves from all of it is prone to decay and stupidity and all of these things. So
it kind of reminds me a bit of the Gnostic archons. I don't know if you've ever read about
do tell.
these ideas, this idea of these beings that are in place to kind of restrict humanity from our true, from awakening, essentially.
Yeah, Mara.
So it's kind of it sounds fairly similar to me. But this is going to be an extremely broad question. Would you say consciousness is fundamental?
Again, ontologically agnostic, empirical pragmatist. I get this one a lot actually.
Yeah.
So I run a big, or help to support and informally run a big research consortium, and we are strict ontological agnostics. But we looked at previous attempts to get the clinical and scientific mainstream to appreciate the deep end of human experience and all its glory and horror and weirdness. And most contemporary attempts, particularly since the transpersonal kids really came in, but even going back to like Burke in the 1890s and some of the cosmic consciousness kids, have really been trying to say, if we can just convince the materialists that cosmic consciousness is the fundamental basis of reality and make the argument for that, we will convince them all, and then we'll all sing Kumbaya and we'll all embrace the deep end and all the weird. I think that 130-ish, 135 years or 140 years or so of them attempting to do this and failing utterly, as far as I can tell, with the occasional weird exceptions of stuff related to quantum interpretations and some of the quantum stuff. That could be a whole nother fascinating topic we probably don't have time for, but that has not worked practically. I'm a pragmatist and I care about what improves outcomes. And so I think a phenomenological approach where we think about what someone is experiencing and what is likely to improve their relationship with that experience, both for them, their friends, their family, the community, and their health, and what promotes good outcomes, is a more interesting approach than saying cosmic consciousness is the answer, right? And I should also mention, as someone who has, for better or for worse, been blessed and cursed with an incredibly wide range of what I'll call noetic experiences. So noetic experiences are they have that sense of deep knowing, right? That you now truly know how things are because you have seen it in that way that is utterly, viscerally convincing, right? The problem is I have had these, that everything is void, utterly convincing, that everything is one, that everything is empty, that everything is divine, that everything is cosmic consciousness, that everything is utterly transient, energetic phenomena, that there is an eternal super watcher, that is total nonsense from any point of view. Equally and compellingly, I have had these experiences and they've all come and gone and contradicted each other. I find no logically consistent worldview that can hold all of them and give respect to how powerfully they communicated that they were true. So the problem is when you've had all those experiences enough times, eventually you start to become what I've become, just from a causal point of view, which again, ontologically agnostic, empirical pragmatist. So I need to come up with a better word for that summarizes that, something or other. But and so I can see pros, I can see very strong arguments for why the cosmic consciousness people, that consciousness is fundamental. And I think there are things you really get from that. And I also think from an awakening point of view that to reify anything as being a permanent super substrate is actually where a lot of people get trapped on the path of awakening. And there is something beyond that that is more slippery, that is less graspable, that is less certain, but actually feels and functions better than that. So not that if I couldn't snap my fingers right now and everybody realized cosmic consciousness or something, of course I would, because that'd be better. But I also think it's a golden chain and a trap from a very, very high dharmic insight, wisdom tradition point of view, that even the Buddha. So there's I can't remember if it's Majjhima Nikaya or Digha Nikaya. It's one of the, it's the first sutta in either the long or middle length discourses of the Buddha, which are from the Pali Canon. You can find these on Sutra Central. And he's going through all of the exalted states that seem compellingly to be an answer. That like boundless space is the answer, or boundless consciousness is the answer, or nothingness is the answer, or something liminal called neither perception nor yet non-perception as an eternal substrate is the answer. That is you, that is reality, that is the answer, that is something you could hold or grasp. And he systematically debunks each of those. And I actually think there's something very, very powerful in that. Not that these can't be very compelling experiences, they can be, but that clinging to any of them eventually actually causes some limitation of our ability to realize fully something that is very transformative and very powerful and beautiful and worth it.
So I'm going to flip that on its head now and say, can science ever fully explain the mystical experience? Or will it ever be able to?
I would be surprised by that. In the same way that I'm going to hint at another rabbit hole. So if you study philosophy and you look at people's attempts to debunk solipsism, for those not formally versed in philosophy, is the notion that you are creating this whole shit show. It's all your mind. Everybody else is simply a fragment of your mind or imagination, and that you are creating the whole thing as God would create a universe.
We're the master that makes the grass green. That's
exactly, sure. And so the problem is the best of all philosophers, including Wittgenstein, etc., through their best attempts at this, and they all failed. They all, I think, demonstrably failed to show that solipsism can be debunked or fully satisfactorily proven. And basically, if you don't think that's true, you have chosen an epistemic frame kind of arbitrarily that you believe is true, and that will give you your answer. But how do you defend that choice? And so I'm getting a little bit esoteric and elaborate here, but bringing that back home, like as a Bayesian, because I'm kind of a Bayesian, we all sort of have Bayesian brains of predictive whatever. Like there's an argument for sort of a Bayesianish brain, not that it's a perfect argument, but you see what I mean. Like if someone said, okay, here are 4 ontologies. This is all cosmic consciousness. This is all an emergent property of impersonal quantum forces and particles and psi squared waves. Or this is all the dream of the great god Vishnu. Or this is all a matrix and it's all a simulation in a computer somewhere. And someone said, okay, here are 4 ontologies, and you've got to pick one or assign pretest probabilities to them, right, as a good Bayesian, and then do some experiment that will move the needle towards one or the other. I have no idea what that experiment is. I have no idea how to assign the pretest probabilities. And I have no idea even how to interpret the experiment. And so I would be astounded if any time in my lifetime science has a decent answer that you really can hold your hat on, that is satisfying, internally consistent, explains all the wild and wonderful things that can happen to human consciousness and the compelling experiences we can have on the path in our adventures in meditation and psychedelics and ritual and all kinds of other ways that fascinating experiences happen. I would be absolutely gobsmacked if somehow that question was resolved in my lifetime or in the next, say, 100,000 years. But that's just me.
Yeah. So,
but that doesn't mean we can't do a tremendous amount in that field of possibility and uncertainty. I remember I was an English major, and I hit that point in one's intellectual development. I was 22 years old, and I was in university. I hit that point in my intellectual development where the arbitrary nature of the sign, that like the designation of something and what is this, what is that, is just a word, it's a label. And so this sort of formal concept, the arbitrary nature of the sign, was hitting me as something that was absolutely horrible. This is horrible. We need certainty, and we find only just sort of very sort of a deconstructionist kind of way of thinking about language and concept and everything. And one day I said this to my old professor, who was a study of the Romantic poets. And he loved the Romantic poets. He's a particular scholar of Blake, who obviously is extremely mystical.
Mhm.
And I said this to him. I was like, "Argh!" And he goes, yeah, but think of the possibilities. And it hit me. It's like, oh yeah, like in a world, think of the possibilities of the arbitrary nature of the sign, all the super cool stuff you can do with that. And your
Mhm.
choices, your aesthetics at that point do matter, right? They
Mhm.
have consequences. Aesthetics are causal. And our choices, maybe we can make interesting choices with that sort of consciousness that maybe they're arbitrary, but that doesn't mean they don't have different consequences. And we can think consequentially of what helps, what makes a difference, what makes a positive difference, what really helps ourselves and other people. Not that we won't make tons of mistakes, but doesn't mean we can't try. And that attempt to try is fascinating. And I think
Mhm.
that's the interesting journey.
Yeah, I
So,
agree. So I'm going to ask you a couple more questions before I let you go. But I'm interested in what you think of AI and how you think what we call AI at the moment. It's not really AI, is it? It's these LLMs. But
yeah.
how do you feel that AI might factor into spirituality and magic and things like that?
Woo! It's already incredibly powerful in changing things. I should tell people that I have the $200 Chat GPT account, and I've got a $20 a month Claude account, and I've got Hermes and Olama, and I've played around with Claude Code and Cowork, and I've used these things for science. I have a research project right now that uses these explicitly to analyze tons of data that would be vastly more expensive to analyze. Though we do human checking, but to like make sure it hasn't totally hallucinated and done something weird, which these things do, as we know.
Oh yeah, they
Um,
do.
and I've also talked to, so that's sort of where I am in my journey, like command line, downloading models and running stuff on my machines and playing with agentic stuff. That's kind of where I am as my background in this. I also used to be a coder back in the day, so I used to code in C++ and other things a long time ago. So I kind of have some vague notion of how these things kind of work and what a
Mhm.
transformer is and what the models are built on in the data sets. Um, I then the question comes, like, practically in terms of magic. I know tons of people who are getting really cool advice and diagnoses and support and psychological support and friendship support, or friendship is a funny word, but like friend-like support
Mhm.
from these models, and they're absolutely incredible. And they obviously know more text than anybody and can synthesize. You can say, "Hey, like, give me a comparison of morality in the Polycanon with an emphasis on the Vinaya, and compare it to the ethics of Crowley across his various developmental phases." And it can do that in a way literally probably no living person could, because it just has all that already,
Mm.
right? So, like, not that it might not say occasional weird things, but like, okay, impressive. On the other hand, and so I also talked to a lot of people who have gotten a lot of very good support and advice from these things. I've also talked to people who have gotten fully into AI psychosis, as you might call it, and
Mm.
like now these things are telling them the next avatar is going to bring whatever, and they've sent people down some incredibly weird and destructive rabbit holes. Not that it might not be fun for the individual, but its interface with the public and society and friends and families tends to be challenging from the point of view of the friends and family and society, right? So,
Mm.
you can
Yeah, yeah.
take lots of angles of approaching the pros and cons of these things. And then there's the question of, are they conscious, which is probably what you were getting at,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
so the solipsism argument, I think, again, I don't know how you would know these things are conscious, in the same way that I
mhm,
don't even know you are conscious from a pure
mhm,
solipsistic. You can't debunk solipsism, so you can't debunk AI consciousness. You can't prove it either, I don't think.
mm.
And again, people can say, "Oh, Daniel, you're just being whatever." No, actually, I think if you take on the best philosophers and look at what they said and what we can know and questions of deep epistemics and ontological things, I actually think that's going to hold up pretty well. So
Mhm.
that's my summary. That said, regardless, functionally, they are super amazingly, impressively, incredibly, confusingly, wonderfully, sometimes deeply flawedly, terrifyingly, capably. I totally understand why the US government is restricting some of these things. I mean, probably
Yeah.
for its own bend the knee or we won't give you access, but also like, oh my God, they could literally like crash the entire world's computer system and hack everything right now,
Mhm.
actually. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and AI targeting, like some of the targeting systems and the strategic systems that the military is developing, I think are absolutely terrifying,
Mhm.
and one of the most destructive and terrifying things we've ever created. I think AI, agentic AI plus bioterrorism and bioweapons has the potential to destroy humanity straight up, not exaggeration, not dooming, like just straight up. I'm also an infectious disease epidemiologist, and my father's a PEDS ID guy, and I know a lot about infectious disease. I also have had a lot of public health stuff I've done recently, looking at biorisk and biosecurity and pandemics and all of that. And that's sort of another life of mine I don't talk about much, but AI plus bio, fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we should all be scared out of our goddamn minds about that. And we should do holy, I don't even know where to begin. Absolutely terrifying. So that's sort of my broad spectrum take on AI. Where does that leave us? I don't know.
I've one good use I saw of it recently. A friend of mine, she wanted to learn tarot, and she wanted to learn using the Thoth deck, Crowley's deck, and there's on ChatGPT, she found a I don't know, it's people can create their own GPTs within ChatGPT. She found one that essentially teaches you the Thoth tarot, and she's learnt that tarot faster than I've ever seen anyone pick up the Thoth tarot, because she's got a constant companion that can help her interpret all the symbology and the readings. And so there's certainly a application there within magic and within,
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's an interesting world. So has spirit, this is a big one for me, because it comes up a lot. Has spirituality become too commercial?
Wow. I look at that question slightly like from a bigger point of view. Spirituality has always been controlled, co-opted, etc., by the central power figures of a culture, right? Always, pretty much. There will always be the shamans, the priests, the popes, the kings that are the divine, whatever. The functionally, that power and the mythic power that comes with spirituality and religion, it's hard. There are almost no cultures. I mean, there's a few, like, these cultures out in the Amazon or whatever, where you don't actually find that, but nearly all of them you do. And so to some degree, right? And so given that that's what happens in human societies, and the psychopaths grab power, and the sort of structures that may not be entirely peopled with psychopaths, but are functionally psychopathic. The corporate structures are fundamentally psychopathic. You're just going for profit above all else, regardless of any other consequence. That's psychopathy, right? So functionally psychopathic systems, even if they're not entirely peopled by psychopaths, will grab all the power that they possibly can, will grab all the money, will grab all the power, will grab all the bandwidth, and that's what they do. So we're in an oligarchic capitalist system, right? So the oligarchs rule, and the corporations control a lot of the power. And that doesn't mean the various clerical factions don't have their power as well, but I think this is a natural consequence of societies and the sort of underlying power dynamics that always occur. So our society is just doing our current version of it. It's like what we're doing with psychedelics. Like someone I know very well said, we're repeating all the mistakes of the 60s and 70s, just the stupid corporate version. Like, it was a psychedelic world.
Yeah, I can relate to that.
So like that.
Yeah, it does. What I mean, do you feel in a way maybe it's been exploited as well on the internet? Is where I'm thinking, like, I keep seeing these kind of I'm trying to think of a good example of where like new age kind of stuff especially seems to get exploited a lot, doesn't it, online at the moment?
Oh gosh, yes. And I think a lot of that is actually funded by like the cosmic right in particular. Oh, the cosmic left is very interesting. The cosmic right has a tremendous amount of funding and support from all kinds of fascinating people and governments and stuff, with the subtle and not so subtle messaging. What was it? Someone was recently telling me, oh yeah, Putin and Xi and whoever are all like the good people who are fighting the evil greys in the tunnels in Iran and the Iran war is all clearing out the slaves of the Dreca reptilians who have been kept in the dungeons. That is emerging almost certainly purely not just in an ecosystem of naive content creators creating a story, but in the context of governments that fund propaganda and promote various messages, and algorithms that fund various and promote various messages, as things like this always have been. So religion and spirituality have always been co-opted by the people in power for their own political ends. We see that going back to the Council of Nicaea, and you can define endless examples of this, that religion and politics and power are all intimately intertwined with each other. And we just get to see the stupid corporate internet version of that today. But same old shit, I think, basically.
Anyway,
what are your thoughts? I don't know. That's my moderately cynical opinion.
Yeah, no, I mean, QAnon's another great example, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
That was talk about
masterful.
suspicious sudden rise of a
very impressive
a soup of conspiracies.
Yeah, the stuff that happened on 4chan, like when certain groups went in to twist 4chan to their own. Right, it's a lot of fascinating to watch all of these people assert their attempts at dominance and corruption of.
People like Bannon, and we did an episode about traditionalism and the traditionalist movement of Gunon and Evola, and
restarting the Crusades.
And how
Bannon big into that.
Bannon and Dugin being Putin's brain, a Russian philosopher, how they kind of utilize some of that and sort of activated 4chan in a way that, it was all very clever.
Very
quite scary,
scary
what
terrifying.
You can do. Anyway, it's been amazing, and I could literally talk to you for hours and hours and hours, and hopefully we'll have you back on, and at some point.
Thank you.
It was a real pleasure, and let's do it again sometime soon.
And everybody out there, keep your wits about you, to hold our opinions lightly. Like, don't take any of this stuff too seriously, except like trying to be a good person, whatever that means. And
if people want to find you online, where's the best place to find you?
You can find me at integrateddaniel.info is probably the best way, and that's got a link to a whole bunch of other stuff, and you'll find me. For those who want to support the charities and the medical stuff, like if anybody out there like wants to try to help us, the clinical mainstream and the scientific mainstream, be better about this stuff, you can find us at the EPRC, so THEEPRC, that's the Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, .org, so the EPRC.org. And ebenefactors.org is the charity that I volunteer for and that I help found and support and give some money to. I just don't have deep enough pockets to give anything like what it deserves to really do this stuff properly. If you want the clinical mainstream to suck less and be good more at this stuff, that'd be great. You can find us at ebenefactors.org. And so those are some of the places you can find some of my things. You can check out the Dharma Overground if you're interested in a community that is very open to the weird and the depths and the strange stuff, dharmaoverground.org. So that's another fun one. Some of the places. And mctb.org is another one. Is where my book is. And FIREKASINE, FIREKASINA, Fire Kasina. My dyslexic brain does terrible things with spelling sometimes. .org. So you can find that. And there's lots of free material there. There's a free ebook online. There's a lot of audio diaries, very magical diary kind of people giving reports right at the end of these retreats, talking about their wild adventures and all the stuff that can happen and how they did it, and warnings and advice. So if you're trying to figure out how to replicate this stuff in a way that won't hopefully ruin your life, you can look there.
Excellent. Do you still do retreats as well?
I do. They're all private though. So I still do Fire Kasina retreats. I tend to do a 3-week retreat at least once a year or so, but this is all with just close friends. So because this stuff is so powerful and it gets so weird, ask yourself the question, who would you want if you could take acid, for example, and have it still have its effect every day, you can't. Like if you take it one day and then the next day you're not going to get nearly as much. But if you could take acid and have it hit just as hard every day, in fact, hit harder and harder and harder as you go, then ask yourself the question of who you would want to do 3 weeks of daily acid hits with for 3 weeks in a group, in a confined, intense space. Ask yourself that question and you will know why I don't do public retreats.
Right, okay.
We're not doing acid, we're doing Fire Kasina. I'm not saying we're doing drugs, we're not, but it's the same level of question will get you the same kind of answer. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Brilliant. Well, thanks again. And like I said, let's do it again as soon as possible.
Cool. Tremendous fun. Thanks. Bye.
Brilliant.